afternoon. My name is Sarah Rubin, and I am with the California Department of Conservation, which is part of the California Natural Resources Agency, one of the two sponsors of our online environmental engagement conference, Building Our Skills Together. Along with Cal EPA, it has been an absolute pleasure to work on this conference. And before we go any further with our final afternoon session, we are going to talk a little bit about interpretation. And Veronica is going to take us through this in Spanish, and then I'm going to say a couple more things about the interpretation option on your Zoom platform for those of you joining through Zoom. Veronica? Uh-oh, I think she's on mute. You're on mute, Veronica.
Thank you, sorry. Buenos días. Tendremos servicios de interpretación en español. Si algún asistente desea escuchar esta presentación en español, busque en su pantalla el icon de interpretación. Ahora verá los canales de idiomas. Haga clic en el español. Para escuchar solo en español, haga clic en el silenciar audio original. Para usar la función de interpretación de idioma, los participantes tienen que descargar la aplicación de Zoom en su escritorio, teléfono inteligente o tableta. Para ayuda técnica o de interpretación de idioma, envíe un mensaje al correo electrónico engagewithus2020@gmail.com. Disfrute del seminario web. Sarah, back to you.
Okay, thank you so much. So for those of you who are joining us for the first time, we have provided Spanish interpretation real time throughout all 3 days of this conference. And if you have not yet tried it, we encourage everyone, all the monolingual English-speaking folks out there, to try this feature. You just click on the little interpretation button you see in the middle of the slide, listen to the Spanish, 20 seconds, a minute, to see what it's like, and then you can switch back to the English channel. As part of our Building Our Skills Together, we would like everybody to experiment and see what it is like to hear the Spanish interpretation. Okay, so we have 4 ways that we are hoping that you will be participating with us today. One is in the chat. The next is in the Q&A. The third are polls we do, and then the fourth, and this is especially important for those on the Cal EPA webcast, engagewithus2020@gmail.com. This email is your way to send us the questions you want asked during our afternoon session. Oh, look at that. It is very sensitive. Okay, if you don't have the conference packet, we encourage you to go ahead and get that right now. In the chat box, you'll find the link to download it. It has all the bios of the speakers and all the information about the afternoon sessions. This is our last session of the 3 days, and we want to take a couple of minutes to thank everybody who has contributed to this conference. 17 agencies and 2 nonprofits. So we're going to give a special shout out to Grace Person from the Local Government Commission and Natalie Hernandez from Climate Resolve. Thank you so much for volunteering. And then I have to give a special thank you to Amy Schwanhauser, Deldy's intern. Deldy, I'm hoping I can turn to you to say something more. For those of you who've already seen that all the materials are on the website, and they were on, all the PowerPoints for the whole 3 days were on before this conference started, and that is thanks to her. She worked so hard on that, and I was so grateful. Deldy, anything you want to add briefly?
Just that it was a huge team effort, and my thanks go to every single one of my colleagues at CNRA and CaliPA for making this happen. I feel like we really touched a need in our conference to connect with each other, and I've just been so privileged to work with all of you. Thank you.
Delde, before we lose you, could we do a big giant thank you to TransLang?
Absolutely. We have gotten so much great feedback about the professionalism and the quality of the simultaneous interpretation that is being provided by Carlos Diaz and Luisa Diaz. They are with TransLang Interpreting Group, and Andrew Monroy has also provided excellent customer service to us as we have all tried to learn together to host a virtual online meeting of this size and scope.
Yes, I want to personally do one more thank you, and that is to my bosses at the Department of Conservation, my director, David Shabazian, and my deputy director, Clayton Haas. Thanks, they've supported everyone out there can only imagine how much time it has taken to put on a 3-day conference with 60 speakers in 6 weeks. I think Delde and I will sign up to do it again tomorrow. Right, Delde?
That's right, we'll wait a bit.
Oh yeah, but it has been amazing and worth it. Okay, so I don't want to cut into the time of our fantastic panel that is coming. I'm going to briefly go over our agenda. We're about to move into training for equitable engagement. What is next for our future? That's what today's day 3 is all about, the future of equitable engagement. Then at 2:30, what's next for California with language access and equity. At 3:30, we have a real treat. We have innovation with meeting design, and we have, for those of you who are familiar with graphic facilitation, where the person is making beautiful pictures, drawing while you facilitate, we have a graphic facilitator, Emily Shepard, and she is real time going to do graphic facilitation. And then we will wrap up with Yana Garcia, the Deputy Secretary for Environmental Justice, Tribal Affairs, and Border Relations at Cal EPA. All right, so before I turn things over to our next session, I would like to ask everybody who is on right now, we've got over 200 people just on the webinar, and I know a big number on the webcast. Can you open your chat function and tell us one thing you're most excited to learn or to hear more about in this afternoon session? And then while you're doing that, I'm going to introduce our 1:30 panel. So we've got Malka Kopel, the co-founder of Civity, Holly Nickel, the racial equity strategist from the Strategic Growth Council, and David Camp, author, and he is the principal of his organization, Dialogue, Wisdom, and Collaboration Group. And for full disclosure, I better say that Malka was my boss starting in the year 2000. So Malka?
That was a long time ago.
Sorry, I've aged up. Go
Thank
ahead.
you, Sarah. Yeah, thank you. And thanks to you and to Delde and your wonderful teams for inviting me to be on this panel and for making this conference happen. It's been great to be on the last day. I've gotten a chance to participate and tune in to a lot of Tuesday and Wednesday, and it's been really inspiring for me, and I've learned a lot of good stuff. So it's very impressive. Thank you. So in a few minutes, my colleagues and I are going to talk about training, particularly with regard to equity. But I wanted to say a few words about training in general, or about training around engagement in general. I've worked with many of you on this webinar, particularly those of you in California state government in my role at the Consensus and Collaboration Program at Sacramento State, where we've done engagement together and training. And I just want to say that this work is really hard. And I know that others have said it before, but I'll say it again. It's hard. It takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of planning, and it takes a lot of skill. And training can help with that. This is something that can definitely be taught. But it does take your time and resources. So I just wanted to put in a plug for training, and not just training around work, not just workshops, but the training beyond the workshop. For any kind of training, including a training in something like engagement, whether it's virtual or in person. We all know that this, after the workshop, people go back to their desks, or now we're all at home, so go back to home at their desks. And we think, wow, what happened in the workshop? And how can we incorporate what we learned into our to-do list? And in order for that to happen, we like to combine training with coaching, so that when people are faced with an engagement, designing an engagement process, or thinking about their next public meeting, there can be coaching, internal coaching and external, that can help them put their training into practice. Because this does need to be a practice, not only for us all as individuals, but we are trying to all change agencies to make new structures that create an accessible engagement process. So I just wanted to say that. And let's go to the first slide. We'll go back one. Thank you. Today, because we're talking about training around equity, I wanted to speak from my work at Civity, which is where we train to address inequity in our culture, particularly across the power divides of race, socioeconomic status, and country of origin. At Civity, we call this kind of training the conversation before the conversation. Civity is a national nonprofit organization. We've been around since 2013, and we focus on culture change. We work with leaders from all sectors, from all across the country, to help create space for intentional connection across difference in their communities. And in order to create the space for that, we have a few foundational principles. One of our partners, by the way, is Welcoming America, who you heard from this morning, particularly around our work with immigrant communities. Civity is also a word that describes the change that we want to see, which is a culture where we all belong. Next slide, please. So we have some foundational principles that inform our work. Here's what we believe. We believe that we can make this change in our culture by being relational, through being with each other in relationship. And we're not talking about best friends forever relationships. We're talking about relationships that are based on respect and empathy, that we hope will lay the foundation for trust. I was really inspired to hear the words of Father Gregory Boyle on Tuesday, as I'm sure many of you were, particularly when he said that the communities he works with, vulnerable communities, are used to being watched, but they're not used to being seen. And I think that's really important. We want to help people see and listen to those who society has made invisible and often not heard. Next slide, please. We believe that these connections that we can make across difference are particularly powerful in our society. Some people in the field call these the weak tie connections, but they are very powerful. And next slide, please. These connections between individuals can change systems, and there's plenty of research to back that up. Next slide, please. In our training, we focus on a few simple but effective strategies. In our training, it's quite experiential in order to help our leaders create the space in their communities for this kind of intentional connection. We think it's best to help them experience it. So our trainings are, we do a lot of one-on-one conversations, story sharing, in order for this experience to really come home to folks. We've been doing it in person in various parts of the country, but we are, like everybody else, moving to doing it online, and that also works. Next slide, please. The kind, as I mentioned, the conversation before the conversation. Before we can talk through issues together, we need to, as Julia Jordan said yesterday, we need to see the humans in all of us and bring the interpersonal connection to the work. And in order for that to happen, we need to not only bring our heads into this conversation, but also our hearts. Next slide, please. So back up there. And then finally, the difference in our society is important. We believe strongly that it should not be skipped over, or that people should see each other's differences, because everybody is different from everyone else, and our differences are also an important part of our identity. So our trainings also focus on putting that difference on the table. So to summarize, training is more than just learning info. It needs to be incorporated into practice, not only individuals' practice, but the practice of an organization or an agency. And this, in addition to all the great outreach tools and structures that we've been learning about in these last few days, this kind of engagement is also very much about building relationships. So that's all for now. I'll turn it over to Holly.
Thank you, Malka. Hi again, I'm Holly Nickel, and I'm one of the leads of the Capital Collaborative on Race and Equity. I'm a racial equity strategist employed by the Public Health Institute, and I work in partnership with California Strategic Growth Council and the California Department of Public Health to implement our collaborative. I'm not an engagement professional or expert, but I feel like I am a relationship expert, an expert in being vulnerable and genuine, to build relationships across differences. And on that note, I'd really be ingenuine right now and a poor ally if I didn't mention that it's been a really hard week for me to carry forward, including today, but I made this commitment to speak, and so that's what I'm here to do. I'm stepping into discomfort and vulnerability and truth right now, and I just want to say that I stand with Black people, and I use my privilege and voice to see you, to support you in your grief, your anger, your numbness. And as a Filipino American and white person of color, I call on people of color to dig deep and to learn and act swiftly and with all our might to dismantle colorism and anti-Black sentiment. I call on white people to do the same around dismantling racism in all of its forms. These are trying times, and the conversations around engagement, they're so critically important to have. Engagement with one another and with the community, historically has been full of racism, has been full of microaggressions and distrust of each other. And so I hope that what you've learned so far in these past days has shed a light on how we can move forward into right relationship with each other, into genuine and respectful engagement with each other. So I just want to say that, and thank you for indulging me in saying my piece about that. Now I'll awkwardly transition into my brief presentation, but I just had to say that.
Awkward. It isn't awkward, and it's fantastic, and we're so grateful to you, Holly, and I really appreciate the sentiment.
Thank you so much. So what is the Capital Collaborative on Race and Equity? We call it CORE. CORE is a community of California state government entities learning together, planning for, and implementing activities that embed racial equity approaches into institutional culture, policies, and practices. And we've been doing that since 2018. Participants learn about, examine, and proactively undo institutional racism within their departments. We partner with many organizations, but our main partner is Race Forward, who convenes the Government Alliance on Race and Equity. And I think they have about probably, coming on probably 200 jurisdictions across the United States that they work with doing this anti-racist work.
Holly,
Yes.
Quick reminder about the interpreter and to not speak too fast, please.
Sorry about that. Yes, I'll do
No,
my
it's
best. So another thing I want to say about CORE is that it implements a commitment by the Health and All Policies Task Force, which is convened by our partners at California Strategic Growth Council and California Department of Public Health to increase capacity of state government to advance health and racial equity. So in addition to the community of practice and movement we're building, we offer 2 capacity building components. One is a training program for state government entities, and the other is a staff team that provides support and coaching, technical assistance to support the departments that are in CORE. So I'll mostly be speaking from a viewpoint of engagement of peers and also clients, because these departments are our clients, right? They're paying for this training and engagement and support. And so although I'm not usually in engagement with community, a lot of the best practices apply for both audiences. We have 12 department teams that are currently involved in CORE. They represent about 19 state entities. And these are in their 3rd year of participation in the collaborative, and we're hoping to add, hopefully adding 10 more new departments this year. And each team has a team coordinator, executive sponsors, general members, and then teams range from 5 to 25 people. And so it is a very big collaborative, very huge training days. On training days, we have about 140 to 160 people in the room in person, usually on these days for 8-hour days. And we hold usually in each cohort 8 sessions per season. We also do in-person meetings for team leads and coordinators for support, and then in briefing meetings for executives as well. And so the main deliverable of the cohort for the first year is to create a racial equity action plan. And the racial equity action plan covers 3 main buckets of work. The first bucket of work we call normalizing, which is talking about and creating a culture inside of departments that allow for discussion about race and racism and their role to address it. The next bucket is organizing. How do we need to come together within the departments to advance racial equity? How do we structure ourselves, and what tools and data we'll be using to move racial equity forward? And the third bucket is to operationalize, basically concretizing racial equity strategies and implementing them with results-based accountability. Next slide, please. And so, you know, we were on our way to having a new season of cohort, and then COVID-19 hit, and we were like, oh my gosh, how are we going to move this online, right? And I think a lot of us, as Malka said, are dealing with this right now, and there's many questions, probably more than answers. And so our questions were like, how do we do this logistically? How do we keep our teams and departments engaged, right? How do we support our teams to keep up their relationship with each other? How do we support our teams to keep up their relationships with non-team members within their departments, right? And then how do we support trust within the teams to work with us virtually, but keep up with those relationships and tackle the hard topic of institutional racism? And it's really, really different and difficult when you move from in-person to online. It had been working, I think, great in person, and now we're dealing with another beast here. And so, you know, we're trying to figure this out, and we're rearing our children, and we're doing all these, you know, having responsibilities at home. So it just really compounds things. And here are some things that I've tried to learn, or that I've learned along the way. So far, we're not completely sure of how we'll move this forward, but here are like the main bits of things that I've learned. So people need training on how to engage, one, in person and virtually. So people don't usually get trained on how to engage in person if they're not like engagement professionals, right? And that's why it's so important for this initiative, this conference, but also what Malka does and what David does is really bringing people into relationship across differences and really learning how to do that. It's very learned. It's not innate sometimes. And so we really need the training, and then even more so virtually, right? And so I'm so thankful for y'all who have put this together that are trying to give us a smidgen of what it means to take things virtually. It's really, really important. So much of what engagement is also is in person is virtually. So I'll say it again. So much of what engagement is in person is virtually. So it just looks different, right? So engagement is listening. It's using facilitation techniques and adult learning techniques to maximize participant experience and to guide conversation to bring about something useful to both the participant and the host and the facilitators, right? So really thinking about what you want to accomplish and finding ways to accomplish it virtually is what you really need to do and to pinpoint. Like if you are, like in our trainings, what we usually do is we have presentations in the whole, but then we break up into small groups. And so how are we going to accomplish that online? It's like a really big part, the bread and butter of a lot of our trainings, right, is the cross-pollination of ideas and learning between these departments. So we've really had to bust ourselves and try to find ways to come up and to learn this new mechanism with which we're working with, right? And so we're trying to figure out the small group breakouts in Zoom. We're trying to learn about like the Google Forms. How can we use Google Forms to work a little bit better and across smaller groups? What are these like polling tools? How do we use them? What do we do? How do, what kind of answers will they give us? Will they be useful, right? And in saying this, it would really be helpful for, I think, a lot of people, if you are moving training from in-person to virtual, to really talk with an engagement professional or a virtual engagement professional. It takes more time, a little bit of resource, but it really pays off in the long run, and it really helps you be more efficient and accomplish the objectives that you would like to accomplish. You know, quality still matters online. Also, don't turn this, like whatever your 8-hour day training is, into like a 2-hour meeting and just kind of say, great, we delivered it, whatever. Really be in fidelity with what you are hoping to accomplish, and pay attention to the mechanisms online that you have to accomplish them. And again, obviously you can't over prepare. You can't, you can't control technology, right? Technology controls you sometimes. Things will happen. Have a backup, or be okay with just looking foolish and calling it a day and rescheduling your meeting. Sometimes that happens, and hey, we'll roll with it. You can't hold large scale trainings alone. There are tons of people, you know, for this conference, there are tons of people on the back end alone just for technology and coordination. And so really drilling down and having roles that people are going to fulfill on the back end is really, really important. And lastly, for this slide, relationships really do rule. Maybe now more than ever, relationship building is certainly critical to anti-racism work and non-business contact. Non-business contact is also really important, right, for me to build those relationships. And so I'll talk a little bit more about that in the next slide. So to become good at anything, right, you need to be really good at fundamentals. Babies, when they learn how to run, first they need to understand how to balance that big head on their bodies when standing, right? And they need to understand what length of gait that they can take and not fall. Basketball players, to be touted as good shooters, need to first learn like the fundamentals of shooting, which can be summed up in the acronym BEEF, BEEF. Balance, elbows, eyes, follow through. Yes, I was a point guard. And so there are these fundamental things, right, that we really in hard times need to go back to in order to accomplish what we're trying to accomplish. And that is good, respectful engagement. And so it's the same for anyone who wants to be good at anything. So if you want to be good at relationships or engagement, here's the fundamental equation that I use. Hard skills. So the hard skills, expertise. You should be a topic expert. You need to know your stuff. You need people to know that you know your stuff. And this makes what you're saying credible and therefore trusted. You're trusted with that information. And then expertise in the technical aspects of engagement and meeting facilitation, right? Which I think Mr. Campt will talk about in a little bit after I speak. And then soft skills. Optimal client experience. This includes on the business side of things. So timely responses, you doing what you say you'll do. And if for some reason you can't do what you say you'll do, you communicate that and you make that right. You apologize if you need to apologize. You have a good product. You get their input about what they need and want, and the solutions with mutual benefits need to come out of conversations. And you need to trust your community, your audience, whatever it is, your clients, that they also are an expert in what they need. And you need to ask them for critical input on your facilitation and engagement style. And you need to make those things right if they're not right. And as far as the non-business contact, that has been really important for me to gain rapport with the people that I'm engaging. And so I text them if I have their number. I email them asking if, you know, how they're doing. And I don't say anything about business. To me, it's not about business, it's about connections. And so really using just being human, bringing it down to a human level and really struggling together, really having successes together. That's what it's all about. And so this is my sort of boiled down foundational equation for that. And so I really hope that, you know, we can take this and spin it into continuous learning. It never stops. Learning about racism never stops, and learning about how to facilitate difficult conversations and engagement never stops either. It really takes practice. And so I hope you take some of these things that we've all said these 3 days and practice them. Thank you.
Thank you, Holly. All right, David, you are up.
Right. So welcome. Hi, y'all. Wish I could see y'all back, but it's not like that. Anyway, again, my name is David Campt, and I am with a group called The Dialogue Company, thedialoguecompany.com. And I am here primarily to talk about my work in engagement. I've done engagement work for a long time. I'm going to do that. But I'm going to link it illustratively to what's happening all outside around our country. So from a training standpoint, one of the things that I think we need to recall or remember is that we often don't think clearly about what meetings are doing. Holly said we need to get clear on our objectives. So I want to go into that a little bit. And I'll tell you where this comes from. A few years ago, I wrote a book called Read the Room for Real. I'll even hold it up. And it's basically about keypad using audience polling in meetings. You know, I have written the only book about using audience polling for meetings. And it's available on Amazon. And if anybody's interested in it, you can join the 24 other people who bought the book. It's an awesome book, but it's about using that technology, because I think that polling technology is such a great addition to meetings. It changes what a meeting is. And so as I was writing the book, I realized that because they do so many different things, it's useful to have like a little mental model about what they do. And then I realized there's a model of what meetings are, and people are often confused about that. So what I want to do is to just review very quickly the idea that there's 3 modes of meetings. And sometimes any meeting can be one mode, or it can be multiple modes, but it's useful to get clear about what the mode of meeting is, because often people are not clear, and that causes certain results. So let's imagine for a moment that you're in a community that's had some situation with the police and a community of color, Black community, let's say, that is considered problematic by at least people in that community. There's been upset, and maybe there's been a protest, and maybe the protest has had some violence within that protest, and now you're trying to heal community relationships. You know, people are saying, "Oh, we got to have a dialogue." So what's useful to really get clear on is, what does a dialogue do? What does a meeting do? And I think this sort of 3 modes can capture that. So one mode of a meeting, next slide, is essentially go back. this thing's very sensitive. You looking for mode 1, which is a download meeting, right? The download meeting is one where the central success dimension is how well is information getting from a central point to people. So your typical, you know, a COO, a CEO wants to talk to the group, or for that matter, a police chief and a mayor want to clarify with the community, like, what are our police engagement standards? Or what are our engagements for either a personal encounter or crowd control, right? The success factor is information going from one to many. So that is a mode of a meeting, and there's ways of doing that better or less well, but that's an important thing to recognize, that that's a objective and that's a particular mode of a meeting. That is different, next slide, than a feedback mode of a meeting, where what's really, where your key success factor is how well information is getting from the many people to the one central point. So your typical town hall meetings to talk about some disruption or something are typically arranged around, like, people line up at a mic, and then, you know, we've all seen those meetings, and they often are both useful and unpleasant. But basically, that is about getting information from many to one. Now, I ultimately think people are not even as creative as they should be about that. So, for example, one thing I do often in meetings like that is, yes, there's a time when people roll up to the mic, but, like, why not have, like, if you don't have audience polling, which of course I think is awesome, but if you want to give people free form input, why not have everybody have some sort of card, one color card for this question, one color card for that question. And then you can hear from everybody, not just the people who are willing to get up on a mic and give a little speech. But the key success factor in a feedback meeting is how well and accurately you hear from the many people to one. And then there's always a question of how well is that information distilled so you can make sense out of it. That's a separate question, right? So one of the things we need to think about from an engagement standpoint is, are we training people to, like, do a rapid fire theming of information so you can feed it back to the group and say, is this what you heard? Like, I'm surprised that as we think about training of people, that whole theming question is not even something that brings up. The reason, like, this cover of this book is a meeting that I did in New Orleans with 2,500 people. I mean, again, I'm not gonna talk about all of that. The point is, we had a whole theme team whose job it was to hear what was happening in the conversations and feed it back to the group so we could check to make sure we heard them properly. So we got download, we got feedback, and then next slide. Then the third mode of a meeting is crosstalk. And that's where the success factor in the meeting is how well the people in the group are talking to each other. So you can imagine, let's take, for example, going back to the police community relations issue. So there's a big disruption. One thing that needs to happen is that people in the community need to hear from the police about, like, what are their engagement rules and regulations. That's one thing. Another thing that might need to happen, might be the same meeting, might be a different meeting, might be a different part of the same meeting, is the people want to make sure that the politicians hear from them. That's feedback. Now, a third point, like, let's suppose that you're going to try to heal community police relations, or if it's a diverse community, have different experience of the police, maybe you want to structure the meeting around people talking to each other. That's a very different thing, right? That's where you need either facilitation or really tightly constructed dialogue plans and questions arranged so that people are have a successful conversation. Probably need facilitation. But my point is, what you're doing, the success factor is how well people talk to each other. That is a different thing than feedback, and that is a different thing than download. And so what's useful to do is to not only get clear as to what your objectives are, but also to set because your process needs to match your objectives, but also the expectations and the public discussion, the preliminary discussion, what it is. So if you come to a meeting and you think you're going to give feedback to the person who ran the meeting and all they're going to do is download, you're not happy about that. Or if you come to a meeting, you think what it's really about is talking to other people in the audience, and all you do is giving feedback to the central person, you're not happy about that. So part of what has to happen is that if you're an engagement professional and you're running a good meeting, something we don't train people to do, I don't know why we don't do that, it's important to not only get clear and have your processes match your objectives, but it's also important to have your communication or what the meeting is be clear so that people your meeting meets what people expect to happen. So I'll say one more thing about this now. So that's what I want to core present. I just want to say, in the midst of all the tumult we have, I know people are wondering, what can I do? What can I do? So I just want to say, as an aside, before the meeting closes, I do a project that's all about helping people talk about racial issues more effectively. That project is called the White Ally Toolkit, because I think that ultimately, if we're going to move forward on racial issues, we have to learn how to talk to each other with compassion when there's no facilitators around. So my project, the White Ally Toolkit, is about that. You can find it from the Dialogue Company website. But given what's happening in the country, I think we're at a moment of real potential breakthrough, but hopefully don't break down. I think it's important we all play our role in that. And it's really, and the thing is, these principles that we're talking about how we can have better meetings, how we can have better dialogue, we need to figure out how to apply those principles of better dialogue to our interpersonal interaction. And so we can all think about that. And the good news is we can all do something about that.
Thank you, David. All right. So, and here is a picture of the book. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to stop the sharing for our discussion. And for those of you who maybe newer to Zoom, in your upper right-hand corner, you should have different options for how you can view the panelists. There's the gallery view versus the speaker view. Let's see here, I might still have David pinned. No, okay. All right, so we're gonna go into some discussion with our panelists. In a moment, I'm going to ask my colleagues to let me know about chat and Q&A options. But Holly and Malka, I actually would like to start with you two, because as we hear David go through these 3 different modes of meetings, part of what I was thinking about is in the training that you all do. And Malka, honestly, I'm thinking even broader than what you're doing with Civity, what you've done your whole career. And Holly, with what you've been doing in GARE. Do you have anything you want to share about the training that folks need to have in order to be able to really analytically think about the type of meeting and therefore what kind of training they need?
Sure, I can start and yeah, thinking more about the training we've been doing at the Consensus and Collaboration Program. What David said is right. One of the most important things that you can do when you have a meeting coming up is to think about the goal of the meeting. And I cannot say that often enough. And that's not an easy thing to think about, actually. It takes some thought and working with your team to really figure out, what are we trying to accomplish at this meeting, and how does that fit in to the rest of the process, including the follow-up, which is also very important. Once you figure out the goal, there is a set of structures that can be utilized to accomplish that goal. And David went through some of them, but it's all in service to the goal. What we do with folks, and I know others do the same, is help people create a facilitation plan that goes through agenda item by agenda item, what the process is, what the purpose of that item is, what the process that serves it is, and what is the and how do we expect to flow through that process to reach the expected outcome. So it's figuring it out, the why in advance, and planning as far ahead as you absolutely can.
Yeah, and I would 100% agree with what Malka was saying. I would add that what's really helpful, and I don't think everyone does this, but since joining the team that I'm on, they're really big about debriefing your meeting, debriefing the engagement. We pick apart everything. We go through the agenda, the exercises, things that we've collected from participants in the evaluations we've collected, but then also what they've submitted in certain exercises that we've done with them that day. And we then revisit our objectives and think about whether what we did on the meeting met those objectives and how we can be better next time. And so we spend quite a bit of time debriefing, and in continuous quality improvement.
Thank you.
Can I add one more thing? I want to one more thing there about because I think that part of what we all have to recognize is that, like, we're doing all this struggling for how to train people, etc., and how to train people in better engagement. I just want to point out, though, that part of the reason we're doing that is because the graduate schools that should be training people for public engagement do not even think about at all things like, how do you run a meeting or how do you do public engagement, right? So you can go to social work school. I have a master's degree in public policy, a PhD in city planning, public policy, social work. You can go down a list. You can go through all of that and never learn how to run a meeting, right? Much less more advanced concepts around that. So the reason that we're struggling with all this is because the public engagement industrial complex has to take this on themselves. And so that is why we need to really support each other in, like, basic ways of understanding this and to uplift the idea of training. You got people sent out there to hear from the public, they don't know anything about that. So that's why it's important to really think this through. It's a little bit changed by the enhancement of the virtual world, but you get the same problems of people not knowing how to think strategically about what a meeting is and what you're trying to do.
Well said. So Jessica, Amy, Grace, Marta, and Veronica, I'm about to come to you. But before that, just to add on to David, I feel like more people need to go to school in conflict analysis and resolution like me, so they get that training. And I also have to replug IAP2 that has a skills symposium where people can get specific training. And at our 3:30 session, we've got someone who actually trained me just this past March, right before the stay-at-home order, Kim. And it was because she was this amazing trainer that I knew her to invite her to this conference. So there are resources out there. All right, Jessica or Amy, who wants to start us off? Or Natalie, who wants to start our questions or comments?
Hi, this is Jessica. I can start us off. There was one question about that's always challenging at certain workplaces, and how to talk more persuasively with decision makers who historically haven't believed or prioritized an effective community engagement. So what can that look like?
Who wants to start that one?
Can she say the end again? I didn't hear it.
Yeah, so it's just about how to speak more persuasively with decision makers who don't historically prioritize community engagement.
So I'm gonna defer to Malcolm in just a moment. Let me just say this. I suspect she might have even more wisdom than the little thing I can do. I think that one of the things we have to face is the fact that if you do in community engagement, you are potentially giving up a certain level of power, because the power of information and decision-making is an important kind of power. And when you go to a community and decide you want to hear from them in some way, whether it's using feedback mode or crosstalk mode or whatever, they have expectations around that. So that puts you in there's pressure that creates. And one reason people don't like to do it is because they recognize that there's pressure. On the other hand, I mean, given that, then I think that as civic engagement advocates, we need to figure out how to present civic engagement activity as something that's in the interests of the decision makers. And the best way to do, I think one way to do that is to help them see the connection between not doing that and screw ups that might happen down the line. Because if you get if your decision making is too out of whack with various stakeholders, that's going to come back to get you at some point. You're not going to be serving your customers or your clients. There'll be political pressure. There's ways in which your disconnect from those stakeholders will show up. So I think that part of the strategy is from a persuasion standpoint is to make that connection, and either show examples from other places in the past, examples from your own situation in the past when that didn't happen and mistakes were made because that didn't happen.
Yeah, and I just want to add, I mean, you said it, David. You need to help the leader understand that it's in their interest to get participation, to involve the community. And if the civic leader is interested in creating a program or passing legislation or policy that serves the community, that will be a better program if you get feedback from the community. In some cases, it could be seen as giving up power, but actually, for what it's worth, it's actually not giving up power because the decision maker is usually where the buck stops and still has all the power that they had before they asked the community.
Maybe what I mean is control. I guess
Right.
what I mean
Yes.
is it's
Yes.
control, not necessarily power. Because
Right. Yeah.
I mean, just to be clear, like I have been in situations in which a big prestigious university wanted to do a community engagement process basically because they were going to tear down some housing and build a big gym, and they basically wanted a civic engagement process to give them cover for doing it. But they knew that even if they used really best practices, it's very sophisticated people, they would see through that. They would see through that they would use. They were worried that the savvy citizens would use the public engagement processes to basically say, we don't want you. It's not about whether the gym is over here or there. We don't want your gym. So they part of what happens is that if you really use involving communication processes, you are more subject to influences than if you don't do that. But I think you get a better outcome, but we have to persuade that. But there's a fear around that. And so part of our job as salespeople is to calm those fears and help people see that they'll be more successful in the long run if they get community engagement.
Okay, so I want to check in with you, Holly. I'm hoping to get at least one or maybe at the most 2 more questions, or I have to go. And I have one other little kind of sales trick for this topic that I want to share. Holly?
For it. Nope, go for it.
Okay, so my sales trick is for people who are a little older, I think of it as the Columbo method a little bit, which is I just usually try to say, oh, like, let's talk through the pros and cons. Let's talk through let's call it for them, it's the safer route with the window dressing way to overly crassly talk about this. Let's talk through what could backfire with that approach, or might there be any shortcomings with that approach, or what are the worst case scenarios with that approach? So rather than me telling them, yeah, you can do that, and it's going to take you like 6 times longer to fix the hole you're going to dig yourself into with your approach, to instead say, let's just think it through. So that's my tip. I don't know if Malka, you have anything to add with that? I feel like we've been in those conversations.
Sounds good to me.
Another question.
Hi, so the next question is from Sarah Green. What is the best resource for information about meeting facilitation and agenda development? And Holly would like to answer it.
Yeah, sure. So I like the Interaction Institute for Social Change. They have a lot of great trainings that they have on, facilitating for conversations through like difference. And I have used them a lot over the years. I have also looked into facilitator guilds in the area. I don't know if I'm new to Sacramento about a year now, but I haven't found any facilitator guilds. But using a facilitator guild, does Sarah Rubin have ideas about facilitator guilds?
Well, in Sacramento, we have a female facilitator group, so you should join us. Great. Sorry,
it's not a book about facilitation and agenda development, but I gave you some resources on an organization you could contact, and certainly looking for a facilitators group or guild is a very great way to start, because they'll work with you. It's not just reading a book, right? You can really tap into some brains.
One other thing I will mention about this guild idea is IAP2, the International Association of Public Participation, has chapters in California. There's 3 chapters. There's a Sacramento region chapter that if you're interested, you can email me about. There's a San Francisco Bay Area chapter, and there's an incredibly impressive, robust, huge Southern California chapter. And those you can find through their webpage. All right, it is
I want to co-sign what's in the chat. Like I was going to say, Sam Kainer's book, Facilitated Guide to Participating Decision Making, is already in the chat. So that's an awesome book. It is from there that I really thought of my 3 modes, because I try to break it down a little more simply, but that book is awesome.
Yeah, and I would just validate David of every facilitation training I do. I hold that book up and say, if this is it, you could only pick one, that would be my choice. I've been using it 20 years.
Yeah.
Closing thought. Anything before we go?
Well, I would say this, in this time where we're at a point of, are we going to break down or break through? I think that, like as a general matter, the civic engagement field, we need to have always been pushing harder, but at a point where people are, the bonds of community are even more stressed and frayed and tenuous than they ever have been, it is even more important than ever that we get back to or start creating participatory processes that include more communities. So on the one hand, a whole bunch of meetings that are all white folks are still bad. So we need to fix that as a civic engagement community. But given that we're now, this issue of who's included and who's not included, I think that it is even more important that we develop the field and our practices, so we're designing processes that are more inclusive. And by doing that, we're inherently, or at least we're much further down the road on the equity problem, but we're also down the road on just like the civility problem, right? Because we need processes that are going to help us have better dialogue as fellow citizens, so that we are looking at each other less as enemies and more as comrades who might sometimes disagree.
Great. So Holly, in the chat, folks are asking if you can type out your suggested resource. I'm going to ask that you can do that. And I want to give all of us who are part of this conference a little kind of relayed plug, because I interacted with Sam Kainer about being part of this conference. And once he looked at our agenda, he said, you have such a great lineup. You don't need me. I don't think I have anything to add. So even though we know that isn't true, that is a big compliment. Thank you so much, David, Malka, and Holly. This has been an absolute treat. We are going to have a couple-minute break before we start our 2:30 session. So we will see you later, and thank you very much. I'm going to do a poll. We've been doing polls at the end of each of these, so we can hear how beneficial this session was to you. We've got over 200 people on the Zoom and lots more through the webcast. More than 200 of you on Zoom, please open your chat box. Share one takeaway. What's your one big takeaway or key learning from this last hour? I'm going to leave this open. I'm going to say goodbye, Malka, Holly, and David, and I'm going to start to welcome our next speakers. Thank you. All right, Jesus, can we turn on your video and mic? And Sabby also. Yay, Jesus.
Afternoon.
Hi, it's so nice to see you.
Likewise.
Okay, say a little bit more. Your audio, a little louder.
I'll get a little closer to the camera. And my apologies if my internet goes down. I was in the middle of a Facebook Live and it crashed a couple of days ago. We know that happens.
Oh my gosh, okay. Let's see, I'm gonna share the results. I know these go in front of whoever's talking's face, but you can move that box. So Jesus, I'm just mic checking everybody. Sabby, am I saying it right?
Yes, you are. Hi, nice to meet you.
So nice to meet you. I've been wondering if I met you at one of the GARE events, but I wasn't sure.
I don't believe so. No.
Okay. And how do you say your last name?
Core.
Core, Sabby Core. Okay. All right. So we've got Sabby, Jesus, Anna. Come say hello to us. Where are you, Anna?
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi.
Yes.
Good afternoon, everyone.
You are looking so office-like.
I am in the office.
Nice. Okay. Great. So I'm going to, it's 2:30. So team, I'm going to stop sharing the poll. Collegial team, is there anything else I should mention before we go to our next session? All right, I'm going to take that as a no. As a reminder, in case you've just joined us, we have simultaneous Spanish interpretation happening throughout the conference. We highly encourage you to check it out if you haven't yet. If you are joining us through the Cal EPA webcast, we highly encourage you to interact with us. You can send an email at any time with a question to our panelists, and that email is engagewithus2020@gmail.com. engagewithus2020@gmail.com. Delby, am I forgetting anything? Okay, I think we're good. I'm going to keep going. So this session is called What's Next for California with Language Access and Equity. Many of you have joined us. We've had a couple. Yesterday we had a language access panel and an indigenous language panel. And so this is a complement to those. I am beyond thrilled that Jesus Martinez is with us, because I know you're so busy, Jesus. He is the Executive Director of the Central Valley Immigrant Integration Collaborative that a lot of us call CIVIC, and Sabi Kaur from the Office of Immigrant Affairs at the City of San Jose. Sabi, I don't know if you know this, but the City of San Jose has been in at least 3 or 4 other presentations as a model. So I've been like,
That's wonderful.
and Ana Mascareñas is the Environmental Equity Director and Tribal Liaison for the Department of Toxic Substance Control. And as always, I'm so happy to be with you, Ana. I love working with you. All right, so I already talked about interpretation. Oh, I'm gonna go to Jesus. So I'm gonna stop sharing. And Jesus, I'm going to spotlight you, which is Zoom speak for you being the big picture. And you're on.
Well, thank you very much, Sarah, for the invitation to be here in this conference, and thank everyone else who is a participant. When I was invited to be in this conference, I pointed out that we're not at CIVIC specifically concerned or focused on the question of language access and equity. But then Sarah convinced me that actually we were, and I began to think about it because we really are. CIVIC was created to work with immigrant families here in the Central Valley, and particularly with Latino immigrants who obviously face a number of difficulties to access services, particularly immigration legal services. Language access is definitely one of them. So thank you, Sarah, for knocking my head against the wall of reality, which we need to pay attention to once in a while. But it's a pleasure to be here with all of you today. My background is on international migration. That's my academic expertise, which I left a long time ago in order to work on other things. But more recently working with this organization that serves immigrant families, like I mentioned before, primarily Latino immigrants in the Central Valley, a region that supposedly has some 900,000 immigrants and about 500,000 children with at least one immigrant family, one immigrant parent. But in addition to that, I'm also an immigrant. I came to the US the first time in 1969, then in 1971, settling in Mountain View. And after living in Mountain View for about 4 years, we moved to San Jose. And I wanted to share that bit of info for a couple of reasons. Because when we think about immigration, we're talking about this broader phenomenon that's called international migration. And international migration, there's a whole area of academic research and work on it that is plentiful at this moment. But it is in the case of the United States, it is a phenomenon that since World War II has been transforming to include primarily non-European immigrants. And this became even more true after 1965 with the Immigration Act that was approved at that point in time. So most of the immigrants that came afterwards ended up being from Latin America and Asia, 2 regions that obviously have cultural, linguistic diversity, but since we're also seeing in the news right now these struggle for civil rights and for justice, this transformation of the immigrant flow to the United States also coincided with the civil rights movement that was emerging in the United States and that was led by African Americans, but also by Latinos, Asian Americans, anti-war, and other social movements. So our concern with immigrants and rights of immigrants coincided with this transformation and evolution of the civil rights movement, so that some of the laws that exist now at the federal and state level dealing with language access have their origins in this connection between immigration and civil rights. So we need to continue to see it in that context. Now, immigration from Mexico in particular, which is the one that I'm more familiar with, is also an immigration flow that has transformed over these years. Historically, Mexican immigration began in the late 19th century as a replacement to Chinese immigration, because as those of you who have done some research on it, Chinese were excluded from immigrating to the US after 1882 due to the presence that they had here and the racism and discrimination that emerged against them. To replace that foreign labor, employers in mining, in industry, in agriculture turned to Mexico as a source of foreign labor. Mexico at that point in time had actually very low population density. So the number of people that came to the US ended up being primarily from the regions of Mexico that had a higher density, which is central Western Mexico. What has happened over the years is that those migrant flows that originated over a century ago became very deeply rooted to such an extent that migrating to the US became like another cultural element, another tradition that families followed generation after generation. And these traditions were further reinforced by bilateral and unilateral policies. So that at this point in time, many of us who are here in the US have our origins in the demand for labor that existed by US employers and the active recruitment of workers to come work in agriculture, railroads, you name it. Now, why is language access important to this discussion? Because when this recruitment of workers from Mexico to work in agriculture, mining, factories, you name it, was made, there was no requirement to speak English. And once we came to the US, in the majority of the places that were employed, there was also no real requirement to speak English for the most part. People who work in agriculture, unlike software engineers in the Silicon Valley, unlike nurses from the Philippines, for example, that are currently being recruited, English was not a requirement. And the places where we settled, like we did in Mountain View, and then eventually in San Jose, were neighborhoods that were predominantly also Latino or Mexican origin, where our neighbors all spoke Spanish. And our parents who worked in agriculture, who worked assembling products in the Silicon Valley in the 1970s and so on and so forth, they attempted to learn English to the extent that was possible. But for example, not every immigrant necessarily has the opportunity to be able to have access to educational opportunities to learn English properly. So when I came and began to work here in the Central Valley, we're developing a project based on DACA, which is the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals program that you know about. One of the requirements of DACA was to have access to an educational program, including English as a second language, GED. We did a quick survey of adult schools in the Central Valley at that point in time, 2013. And most adult schools in the Central Valley did not have Spanish language GED, did not have ESL classes. So people, even if they want to have an opportunity to learn a second language, do not necessarily find that it's feasible, that it's convenient to them, that coincides with their hours off from work. So this is a little bit of the real world situation that people in places like the Central Valley face on an ongoing basis. They are hired and recruited to work in places where the language is not necessarily English as the primary language, but also the living conditions are such that even if they want to learn English, it's not possible for them to do so in an adequate manner. So this is our responsibility as representatives of community-based organizations and even government sector agencies. It is our challenge to try to address this phenomena that is created by this process of globalization, that leads people to be recruited to come to work in the US, where they have, at this point, no opportunity to legalize themselves. It is has been largely a family-based migration tradition in the case of Mexicans here. But the opportunities to be able to have access to English language learning are not necessarily there. So we need to look at this phenomenon as not only an individual decision, an individual capacity, but look at the context, look at the opportunities that are there, look at what the educational systems and the local infrastructure actually provides to immigrants, which in many cases it's limited. So that explains why immigrants, particularly those that have low educational levels from their home country, also struggle so much to be able to learn and become fluent in English, or learn it to a level that is appropriate. So we had situations like people like myself, a kid who had to translate for his parents whenever he did, and whenever we had any type of contact with an outside agency. So even if they wanted to, they could not learn English to the extent that my brothers and I were learning at that point in time. So I know we have a few minutes, so I'll cut it there, and I'll be happy to touch on some other issues with our colleagues later on.
Hi, everyone. My name is Sabi Kaur, and I am with the Office of Immigrant Affairs with the City of San Jose. And we have a tiny little office. We are about 5 people in there, and I am the first ever language access coordinator for the city. Next slide, please. So the office itself was established in 2015, and after that we developed a welcoming San Jose plan with the help of community partners. We had a community engagement process for months and came up with this plan. And one of the pillars of the plan is access and engagement, and it starts with language access. Next slide, please. So one of the things I wanted to talk about, and I think Jesus must be familiar with this, but it's the demographics of San Jose and why language access is really important for that. So over half of our households, that is 57% of the households, speak another language at home. 1 in 4, which is 25% of our residents, are limited English proficient, revealing they really need language access support. And clearly, comprehensive and quality language access is the first step towards becoming a welcoming city. So in November 2016, we enacted the first ever language policy. And to make it easier for our staff to be able to provide help to our residents who need it, who cannot speak English. Next slide. So just talking about the systems change that we're trying to effect in San Jose, and language access is part of that. So we've been working with the Government Alliance for Race and Equity, GARE, for the past 3 years. And we weren't really thinking specifically about the equity issue, though it is an equity issue, but it was simply the work that we were talking about. So we learned to frame our work in 3 distinct overlapping pieces. The first is normalize, which is shared understanding and urgency. The second is organize, create an internal infrastructure and partnerships. Operationalize, which is tools and data. So when we frame it in the systems change model, it helps us think through all the elements needed for true systems change. Next slide, please. So normalizing language access. And the first thing, like I said, we did the language access policy and plan in 2016. We also started staff training for language access. We've trained over 1,100 staff. And what do we do in the training? We basically cover the basics of Title VI, how to work with an interpreter. Thank you. and how also review our language access plan. And you'll be surprised how many people don't know we have a language access plan. And we really want to focus on what it feels like for the limited English community when they come to the city hall and they have a burden on their shoulders because they can't speak English and they can't really make use of the services that the city offers. Also, we want staff, bilingual staff and monolingual staff, to understand each other and each other's experiences. So we have a lot of deeply personal stories, as Jesus mentioned, that there are people who are child interpreters for their parents, and bilingual staff talk about this extra responsibility that they carry on their shoulders, and they have this extra burden. And for many monolingual staff, they begin to realize how difficult it is to interpret and to live the life of people with inequities every day. We do a simple activity, which is English to English interpretation. So we are hoping to make everyone understand, every single person in the room, how difficult it is to interpret and how bilingual staff are not really trained translators and interpreters. So it's unfair and not equitable to expect them to do the job of professional translators and interpreters, especially with no training. We also let them know about the resources we have available. We have a toolkit, we have a language map, which I'll talk about a little later. Thank you. Next slide, please. So the next phase is the organizing phase, which includes infrastructures and partnerships. And we started with a temporary language access coordinator, which is me, but we still need a long-term staffing strategy. We need dedicated staff, and in every department, we need staff whose job it is part of their responsibility to provide language access. We also provide a menu of professional language access vendors. These are vendors who do translating and interpretation, and we've created a matrix for that. And the idea is that we communicate effectively with our residents, which is part of our job, and to do it professionally. And we also don't want staff and the residents to rely on their children, their neighbors, friends to help work with the city and to get the services that they need. And for the first time ever since the COVID-19 pandemic started, we have a language access unit in the Emergency Operations Center. And this is comprised of bilingual staff from all around the city. We've also engaged with our community partners to talk about the Welcoming San Jose plan and how to continue to prioritize language access as work that is important and essential for the city. So the questions for, I think, all organizations is really to think through what structure best fits, thank you, best fits your organization's culture. Do you want it to be centralized, which is we are somewhat, or decentralized, or is it a hybrid? Also, do you want to prioritize budgeting and have it as an explicit line item in every department budget? And do you have a bilingual staff policy? You need to hire more bilingual staff. Next slide, please. And the next phase is operationalizing. And that's one of the key lessons we've learned through our engagement with CARE and our equity work, and also language access. It's not about doing more work, but just doing the same work differently. And really our work is to communicate effectively, and the data shows us that we need to include additional languages in our communications for it to be effective for our residents, and we are finding that out in our emergency right now. We've also made some progress. We do have some tool available, like a toolkit for language access. We have language maps that we can use for outreach. And as I said, a list of approved vendors for professional translators and interpreters. We are also currently working with an external consultant who's here in the audience to develop recommendations for the structure, operations, and resources needed in a city the size of San Jose. And our greatest challenge has really been about embedding language access in everything that we do and embed it for our staff also. So you can think of language access as separate from equity, but it has to be embedded in everything we do. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm so sorry about all the slide
okay.
problems. I've mentioned it before in the conference. This is a very sensitive computer I'm not used to. Thank you so much. That was so helpful. Mavish and I are these like giant fans of everything you all have done. We're so proud of you all, and I just am such a big fan of your staff. So thank you again.
Thank you for having us here.
Okay, Anna.
Hello, good afternoon, everyone. It is a privilege to be part of this panel today. And especially with the connections to San Jose, that's actually where I was born. And my parents met at San Jose State University through the Chicano movement. And it's where my tios and tias are. And, you know, connecting to actually, Jesus, what you shared earlier, my grandmother actually worked in a former Atari factory in the Silicon Valley after having moved there from the San Joaquin Valley as a third generation farm worker family. So I'm very grateful that she instilled in all of us as her legacy, a sense of purpose, of social justice, of human dignity for everyone. And that's particularly what I'm feeling right now, as I'm sure many of you are, in what we're all experiencing. And I'm reflecting on that a lot. So for introduction, my name is Ana Mascareñas. I'm the Deputy Director and Tribal Liaison at the California Department of Toxic Substances Control, which is in the California Environmental Protection Agency. And our department works to protect people, communities, environment from the harmful effects of chemicals related to cleanup of sites, enforcing hazardous waste laws, and compelling safer products. So I get to work with an amazing team in the Office of Environmental Equity to implement 3 programs that are meant to intersect across the department. It's part of the, I think, hybrid approach that Sabi was referencing on environmental justice, public participation, and tribal affairs. Our role, for background, is to support community engagement, promote environmental justice and equity in decision-making, and conduct government-to-government tribal consultations. So I'm hoping to cover 3 areas over the next minutes, and I know that there's a number of good questions that are going to come up for dialogue with my colleagues on this panel. First, I want to just highlight again the wealth of resources that have come up and been built around equity and language access during this 3-day conference. Next, I'll share some thoughts on plain language and how information and words can be used to share power versus disinviting and disempowering. And I will be wrapping up with what I see as some of the barriers and opportunities facing large institutions like the state of California in providing language access services. So first off, if you didn't catch it yesterday, please make sure to see the presentations, Sarah mentioned this as well, and the recordings of language access best practices and Indigenous languages best practices for engagement. In some of the presentations also on day 1, we emphasized planning for language access is not an add-on, but part of the upfront planning process. And I think that was centered very well, and really big thank yous to Deli Reyes and Sarah Rubin and the entire team for building that into the planning process for this conference as we're all learning together. I see learning how to connect language accessibility in online meeting formats, giving us an opportunity to reopen and reset how we view and implement language access across our work. For background, in our own department, we adopted a language access policy that goes beyond a number of state policies, but we're in the middle of, while implementing it, also some challenges on operationalizing, which is what Sabi mentioned or referred to earlier. There are a number of talented bilingual staff across our agencies. We should be actively recruiting and truly inviting more. And we need to take a look at equity and workload, making sure that as we collaborate with contractors who have the expertise and collaborate with staff, and making sure it's an equitable workload for our own workforce as we invite more bilingual and multicultural employees into state service. And referring to a topic that our colleague Marina Perez brought up yesterday, plain language. Words are powerful. People can use them to share information and power, or we can use them to disinvite and disempower. And I really believe that in this intersection of language, access, and equity, as step number one, we need to make sure that we're finding solutions around plain language. That means words and phrasing that can be accessible to the public in any format. And since languages are so rich and varied, we're never going to fully meet that goal, but it must be the place from which we start. If it's not understandable in one language, it's certainly not going to be immediately understandable in the next. So I'm the daughter of a former middle school English teacher as well, and I recall my dad quoting, "If I would have had more time, I would have written a shorter letter." And the reason I bring this up is because to me, it does come down to respect for people's time when you're asking them to understand and engage in a process. And often we put more words out there because it's perhaps well-intended, but the impact is not what we're seeking, which is creating plain language documents. It doesn't take it away from any of our work and disciplines, technical role or jargon, but it is our job as public servants to really provide that bridge. So we know that plain language is going to vary based on your community audience, and we really have to put in the work and the resources up front to make sure that we understand and respect people who are bringing in that expertise to help us build that bridge. So I'll note that we have a number of public participation specialists and colleagues and allies across Cali, PA that have worked very hard to meet these goals, and it's a daily situation that we work through, and we still have barriers while we do have successes. Wrapping up on my third point for today's panel, access to information, and it was shared in the framework earlier, is in your preferred language that you can really engage in, is fundamental to our state and civil rights laws. And what we've seen over the years is variation in how that's actually implemented by government. And I wanted to highlight just a couple things that, in California, for example, state procurement guides how each agency approaches their contracts and working with vendors, and it can be really difficult to navigate. There are important rules in place for a reason, but I think we as a state, and in this time, as we're reopening and rethinking how to make meetings more accessible, how we actually approach and support the goal of equity in language, and maybe how some of those frameworks are keeping in place a system that makes it more difficult. Many of our agencies are fee-based, which was actually mentioned during an earlier session. And while that may sound very insider and wonky, it is a real issue when it comes to operationalizing in public service language access and how we see it as an equity issue. So I really, through the first half of this year, but also through history, we see policies built on policies that keep marginalized and disadvantaged communities in place. And I think it's important that we recognize as we invite people in to build partnerships, we have to stay centered in understanding that actions really that result in more equitable outcomes, more access to language resources, more access to changes, and seeing the result of what your participation does mean when we've invested and how we're doing it, what we're doing with the resources we have. Those are the kind of equitable outcomes that I think do help build trust. And while we've made strides across the state, and I think as shown in the panel here today and throughout the conference, there is clearly a lot more work to do. So I hope you that you take a look as this third day wraps up at all the resources that have been provided on language access best practices, truly thinking through how plain language in our role as serving and building a bridge to communities, how that builds equity, and that we continue to partner in finding solutions to those opportunities and barriers in providing language services. This has been an inspirational several days to participate in, and also so important that to hold us as in public service accountable for doing more. Thank you for allowing me to participate in the panel today, for inviting me, and I look forward to the Q&A.
Thank you, Anna. Okay, Jesus and Sabby, I'm going to ask you to turn your video back on before we go into our Q&A. So everyone out there, I'm going to start with the webcast folks because there's a little delay. Webcast, if you haven't yet, this is your opportunity to send a question in to our Gmail, engagewithus2020@gmail.com. Those of you who are participating through the Spanish language channel on Zoom, we highly encourage you to send your question in. We want the question in Spanish as much or more than, I'm gonna go ahead and spotlight myself. Okay, there we go. Sorry, Emily. So we want your questions as much as anyone's, and then people who are on Zoom, we hope you will chat and use the Q&A function. And so while you're sending in your questions, panel, I have a question for you. And I'm gonna soften it a little by giving you my own little tip to start so you have time to think. So my question is, if there was one or two pieces of advice that you could give to folks about something specific they might do to support culture change or to support the kind of effort or argument around pushing the need for language access to be a foundational piece of our engagement work versus an add-on, I'm wondering what you would say. I'm going to start with my own little, I did a little sales, my version of sales tips earlier. I'm going to start with my own sales tip. So, especially within the last 5 years with cities, counties, special districts, and state government, for better or worse, I find a lot of people in leadership are concerned about everything that's the worst case scenario. What's the worst that could happen? And so I use that as part of my argument. So when they say, well, why do we have to do anything more than Spanish, or no one's gonna look at it, or no one's gonna notice, or whatever it might be, I always say, okay, that's one choice. But let's just think through some worst case scenarios. Who might possibly criticize this process if we don't have an interpreter at the meeting or have something translated? And then I might remind them of oftentimes how inexpensive it is to have materials translated. So I'll give one quick example of to translate a flyer. Let's say it costs $25, and then they're like, why would we do the other language? But I'm thinking it's only $150 extra you're spending to get like 6 more languages, and then you're doing that much more. And it's a starting place. So that's my 2 cents. Anyone want to go first?
Well, I'll take a brief stab at it with a recommendation or suggestion. I think what we're seeing in San Jose, but not only San Jose, but also in other cities, is an institutional approach that is comprehensive, that includes the development of formal city policy on immigrant integration. So they have a plan. And the development of local level plans, I think, is important to help really create institutional change to ensure that this is done in a systematic basis in a community like San Jose that has people from all over the world. Here in Fresno, for example, we try to also promote the creation of an Office of Immigrant Affairs, which ran into a major stumbling block, which is the unwillingness of the mayor and some other city council members to approve any type of monies that could be assigned to that potential office. So, but nevertheless, it's worth the fight to bring about this institutional change. We know institutional change takes more effort, takes more time to achieve, but it can also provide greater results, and even some temporary results can be achieved. So that when we began to have that discussion in Fresno, some very pro-immigrant council members took on the banner of ensuring that some of the basic documents are going to be available to the population in English, with some very important issues being addressed. So that is part of the result that can be brought about. And secondly, for our own internal organizational capacity, I think that we have to provide ongoing training opportunities for staff members, because simply because I have some staff members who are recent college graduates born in the US or born in Mexico, it does not necessarily mean that they develop the language competency in both languages that is required. They need ongoing training to ensure continuing improvement in that language capacity in order to serve our target population, which in our case are Spanish-speaking Latinos.
Tabby?
Sorry, I'll just second what Jesus just said about training. I think it's really important that bilingual staff receive training in translation, interpretation, so that they can do their job professionally and without feeling that they really don't know what they're doing. So, but I think it's also important to spread the language access message, so to say. So really convincing also the monolingual speakers that this is really important. So I think our language access trainings have helped to push the envelope a little bit.
Anna, want to add on?
Yeah, I will stay on the the theme of training actually. And I see in the chat that some folks are asking for language access policies. Every state agency does this policy. In building, I think that I have been a part of a training and want to make sure that we can share this type of training. It was kind of linked to yesterday, but leading from a place really of empathy, of really truly understanding what others are experiencing and why this is important for us to do is key and fundamental. And so trainings that help people understand or support their understanding of what it would mean. For example, if there's a message about your employment, about something in your neighborhood, something affecting your children, and to receive that in a language that you don't feel comfortable with or you don't understand how that really is, what that feels like. And so I think including that aspect in any training is really, really critical, and appreciate what Jesus and Sabi have both shared on that.
Great. So, okay, I'm going to check in with Veronica, Marta, Amy, and Jessica. Anything you want to raise from the chat, the Gmail, or the Q&A for our panelists?
There's nothing in Spanish that has come across.
There's a question in the Q&A
So,
that has.
For the chat, a question is, does Jesus and Sabi have a particular source for a language training for staff?
So we do have a vendor in the East, and I can send the link to Sarah and Deldy later to share with everybody.
Jesus, you're on mute. I don't know if there's anything else you want to add.
No, I was going to leave it to Sabi to answer that because I think they have far more experience than I do.
Okay, other questions or comments in the chat? Jessica, Amy.
Yeah, there's a question from Claudio, and they're asking, in these times of fiscal hardship and statewide deficit, how should Cal EPA ensure funding to guarantee staff agency training on diversity, equity, inclusion, as well as plain language use?
Thank you, Claudio. I'll jump in as a panelist on that question. This has been a topic that came up in the opening this morning, and it's very real that the state is going to experience a $54 billion projection deficit. And I think what's key to remember is that, at least I experienced, even though we have all these federal and state and local requirements around language access, there has continued to be a question around whether we have the budget for it. And to really, focus our budget and our decisions and keep our priorities clear, and have that conversation in a transparent way is where we need to go. And so to address a little bit more on your question, Claudio, forums like this, making sure that it's part of any planning process up front, budgeting for the kinds of engagements we're going to be doing. I think building in those ways throughout our agencies, making sure they're explicit and visible is a way to make sure that we keep our principles and our values where our budget is.
If I may, I'd like to add a related comment. In the last few days, I've been getting some questions from funders regarding the COVID-19 related contact tracing work that the state of California has initiated. So obviously a major priority. And as far as I know, the funding that has been created by the state of California for this is being funneled through the county level health departments. And the information that I'm getting from these funders that have contacted me in recent days is that at the county level, at least apparently here in the Central Valley, I wouldn't know about other parts in the state of California, the county health departments seem to be having a lot of trouble recruiting people who are linguistically and culturally competent to be able to provide that service to immigrant families in this region. So I don't know if this is a statewide problem that has emerged, but here's a clear example of how a state-sponsored program that is being funneled through county health departments apparently is not at the moment able to generate the necessary qualified labor force to be able to carry this out. So part of our thinking is that if the county health departments are having this problem, part of what we can do is put them in contact or at least promote the idea of establishing partnerships with nonprofit organizations that may have some of that linguistic and cultural competency and that are doing that type of work, for example, in census-related work, among other things. So it is a way in which this problem can create a new form of partnership between the public sector and nonprofit sector to be able to serve a population in need.
Okay, anyone else want to add in? Any other questions that have come up, team?
Yeah, there's another question about from Victoria. She's asking, what are some key points that are important to include in a language access policy?
Anyone want to tackle that? And one thing that comes to mind, Mavish, I think you're on as a participant. I hope you don't mind. Maybe you could put something in the chat because this is something Mavish Hassan, who was one of our panelists yesterday, wrote about, has done a lot of work on, and specifically she worked on the language in the narrative in the city of San Jose's language access policy. So maybe you could put some reference stuff, Mavish. Anna, Sabi, anyone want to add in?
I would just add very briefly that Welcoming America, for example, is developing and has a number of very valuable resources. We just became a Welcoming America member this past month, so we're tapping into those resources. I would invite anyone who is listening to this to take advantage of those resources that already exist, which are plentiful. And I also put online some links to a couple of resources. Migration Policy has a lot of data on migration to begin with. And also an interactive map from lep.gov that has a lot of information related to limited English proficiency resources. So those are two that I would recommend.
Great.
Thank you. I'll add in briefly for, those are excellent resources that I think many of us have drawn upon. And I'd be interested in seeing the resources that Navish has as well to create language access policies. I would highlight for, especially for state agencies, there are a number of requirements related to our civil rights laws, Title VI, around making sure that funds expended do meet these requirements. So for especially environmental work, looking at vital documents is kind of where the rubber hits the road, and defining vital documents. And so I would recommend that any policy clearly discusses vital documents in as much detail as you can, because that's where you're going to have some really rich conversation and a lot of different perspectives on what is vital and what is not. And I think it's important to ask, that we're in public service. This information affects the people we serve, but it's important to have in a policy. So I think this in those documents that are shared, but I just wanted to note it.
Right. So we have gotten a suggestion to go ahead and wrap up so that folks can have a little break. before our 3:30 session. So is there any last kind of closing comment before I thank you all profusely that you all would like to make before we take a short break before our 3:30 session? Jesus, how about we go in the order we talked? Jesus, okay?
I do. International migration is part of the process of globalization. It's not going away temporarily. Obviously, it's been impacted by the pandemic, but international migration is part of our reality. So California, to go back to the title of this presentation, is going to continue to be impacted by international migration. It contributes to our dynamic economy that it leads the world many different ways. So we need to welcome immigrants. We need to also ensure that they're integrated as well as possible. City level programs like San Jose and others are very important in doing this. And we have to prepare ourselves for this future.
Sabby?
So I think it's important to remember it's not just one person or a unit or a department. It has to be throughout the institution. Change has to take place. So keep fighting the good fight and, keep on going at that language access work.
Thank you. Anna? Last words.
It's an honor to be on this panel with you, Jesus and Sabby, and thank you again, Deldy and Sarah, for everything to make this conference so rich and so helpful and filled with purpose for everyone. I would like to share that in addition to the really practical resources that we're sharing, just being mindful of how much power we have in our words and our communication and how we share with each other information and connect is so important, and making sure we have access to that information to connect with each other and respect each other and understand each other is what it's all built on. So thank you for creating this panel around equity and language access, and I look forward to the wrap-up session later. Thank you. Great,
thank you. Okay, so I'm gonna put up a kind of title slide and go on mute. We'll take a break. It is 3:17. We'll start again at 3:30. We are gonna keep encouraging everyone to use the Gmail Engage With Us 2020 Gmail address if anybody has any questions or comments, as well as the Zoom chat and Q&A. Thank you again so very much, Anna, Sabby, and Jesus. We are very grateful to you, and we'll see you in just a little bit within a super exciting 3:30 session. Welcome back to our online conference, online environmental engagement conference, Building Our Skills Together. This is our final panel session of our 3 days of our 60 speakers. It has been incredibly empowering, and I would just say for me, I feel so much more connected now to be in community with other people who really care about and are deeply passionate about engaging with people in our communities. I can't tell you how excited I am about your all session. I'm very excited to introduce our participants. Kim, I don't know how to say your last name.
It's totally fine. It's Heshka.
Heshka. So Kim Heshka from Dialogue Partners, Gina Bartlett from the Consensus Building Institute, and Emily Shepard from the Graphic Distillery. These are 3 amazing people who are gonna wow us.
This is Natalie. I just wanna uplift in the chat that Carlos says that you have a lot of echo.
Oh, me?
Yes.
Okay, I'll stop talking. It could have been when I had my fan on, which I've turned off. Could you ask him if it's better?
It's a little better now you're closer.
Oh, thank you. That's helpful feedback. All of our whole building our skills. So I'm very excited to turn things over. We're gonna go right to Emily's screen. And I just wanna encourage everyone who's participating both through the webcast. We've got about 100 folks watching through webcast. We have over 200 who are on the Zoom. Please actively use the chat, the Gmail, or the Q&A feature as we go. Okay, so I'm gonna go on mute and hand things over to you all.
Take me off mute. So welcome everyone. We are so, Sarah, thank you for getting us started. We are delighted to be with all of you today. I wanted to begin in the spirit of truth and reconciliation, and I wanted to offer a land acknowledgement. Some of you may have already heard my Canadian accent, and some of you may have not heard it, but this is something that we commonly do here in Canada. So I just wanted to begin in the spirit of truth and reconciliation by recognizing that I'm coming to you today from the traditional territory of the Treaty 6 people as well as the Métis people. And I offer this recognition that this is the land that I'm standing on, and I want to recognize that it was home to people before settlers came to what is now known as Canada. And so just wanted to begin there. And for those of you who maybe don't know whose traditional territory you might be coming on or speaking from or listening in from today, I encourage you to take a few minutes and do a little bit of research and find out where you are coming from. As mentioned, there's going to be 3 of us on our panel today. So I'm accompanied here with the very talented Emily. Gina's going to be speaking to us here in a couple of moments. And everyone, today, this session is all about innovative meaning design. What does it look like to involve and engage people online? We've been doing this. Those of you who do this work of engagement, we've been doing this for a long time, and yet COVID-19 has brought a whole new level of what does it look like to bring people together online, and it's pushing us and asking us to come up with new and different ways. We're going to be spending some time talking about a couple of challenges today, some of the ones that both Gina and I are very much facing in our own work that we actually think many of us are going to be facing. But maybe just before I jump ahead and talk about, where we're headed on this session, I'd really love to, let's bring up that chat box as well. And if people who are on the line right now, just introduce, share your first name, maybe where you're calling in from. And I'd love to share just, if you could type in a word or two, what's kind of top of mind when you think of innovative online engagement? So share your name, share maybe where it is that you're listening in from today, and then just something about, what's top of mind when you're thinking of online engagement and innovating it in new and different ways. So I know people are coming in saying like, this is new and needed. They're looking for resources for facilitators. So everyone, I want you to just keep those chats coming in so that we know who's on the line, as well as some of the things that you're thinking about related to online engagement. I'm seeing a couple more coming in, people saying, how do I show up the best? How do I have confidence in doing this kind of work? How do I have effective conversations in this online space? So everyone, today there's a couple of things that we're going to spend some time on. We're going to talk about what does it look like to build rapport across distance. In the online world, we don't get to be with other people in a room. So how do we build some of that rapport? We're also going to talk about, can we even still be engaging in really complex issues when we're in this online space? And we're going to talk a bit about what does it look like to build trust and relationships related to any of these topics. Because if you're at all like me, you know that engagement isn't just about getting input. It isn't just about getting feedback from people, but it's also about what we leave behind and what are the trust? What is the trust? What are the relationships that we are leaving with people? So those are some of the areas that we're going to be tackling. Gina, I'm going to turn it over to you here in a moment. She's going to set the stage, kind of give us a little bit of context and background. And I just want to say, those of you who are in the chat still offering ideas on what's top of mind for you, keep those coming in. It helps us as panelists know where you're at and what you're thinking about. But Gina, let me turn it over to you to give us how do we want to get this started? What are some of the things that we should be thinking about as we walk into this session together?
Great. Hello, everybody. I just put a chat in a link to a poll in the chat. And if there's things that you want to articulate for us, in addition to top of mind, about what you worry about when you're striving to engage groups online, we really want to kind of share some of what we've been doing. And the context for today is, you know, how do we engage with innovation, with creativity, and bringing energy into the conversation? And, you know, in reflecting and kind of thinking about where we are at in our practice with this, is that we realize that tools are great, but they're only as great as we are able to use them, and if they're really tied to a specific purpose and audience. So as Kim said, we want to talk through some examples of what we're doing and how we are grappling with the challenges associated with that. And we're going to break out a couple different vignettes and stories about the work we're doing, as well as kind of putting the tools out there for you to use and try yourself as we walk through these. So I'm going to hand it back to Kim, and I'll be checking in on some of the worries and thoughts that we're hearing from all of you. And then we'll be thinking about and hearing Kim's story around how to build rapport and create some across distance.
Thanks so much, Gina. Now, everyone, I'm noticing in the chat box, and here's the thing, everyone. Gina and I and Emily today, we're going to try to be modeling some of the things that we're learning in facilitating online with all of you today. So here I am modeling, everyone. As we notice things coming up in the chat box, best to just bring it up with everybody else. And so a couple of things that came up where someone said, this doesn't look like a PowerPoint presentation. What am I looking at right now? So yes, we wanted to say that we don't have a PowerPoint presentation today. We wanted to try something new and different. Emily, who you can see on our screen, is a graphic, Emily, do I say graphic recorder, graphic artist? What's the right word?
Yes, a graphic recorder or graphic facilitator. Sometimes I feel like I'm the graphic part of the facilitation team.
Awesome. Awesome.
Great.
Thank you. So everyone, you'll notice that we don't have static slides. We have, and Emily's going to talk later in the session a bit about graphic facilitation, what's the value, and really how are we seeing it be really beneficial to this online space. So you're going to notice that the slides are going to continue to grow and build as the conversation goes on.
I just wanted to flag a couple things, Kim, if I could, that are coming up in the poll around what do people most worry about. They worry about the internet dropping. They worried about people falling asleep and not staying connected. They worry about making sure everyone feels included and heard. And then letting people know that they have time to talk, that they're not in too much of a hurry, and how to listen when you're conducting a webinar. There's a lot of rich challenges here, and the things that we grappled with when we thought about what should we share and talk about today.
Thanks so much, Gina. And everyone, here's the thing I just have to say right off the hop, listening to those worries, I really wish that Sarah would come online right now and say that we had 2 hours together because there is so much there. And so I just wanted to make this offer, everyone. We're going to cover some tools, we're going to cover some suggestions, but I believe that all of you can access our contact information after this. Please, if you have questions, if you have follow-up things that you'd like to talk about, feel free to reach out to us, because I feel like we are going to scratch just the surface of some of this, how do we design for the online space, and appreciate that there are many, many other questions or concerns out there. So we'll just make sure that we can share our contact information with Sarah so that people can have access to that. So let me start here, everyone. We wanted to begin with this. is that today's session is supposed to be about tools and what are innovative ways that we can design. Now, we could send you a giant list of every tool that's out there. There's tons of tools out there. We're using one right now. Zoom is this incredibly powerful tool that we can use. Many of you, Gina had put in the chat box, Poll Everywhere. That's another great add-on tool. And the list goes on and on and on. But here's the thing. Tools are only tools. They come to life. They create the kind of experience that we want. They achieve the kinds of objectives because of the people that deliver the tools, as well as the design and the thinking that goes into the delivery of those tools. So I just wanted to offer that as tools can sound new and shiny and exciting, and yet if we haven't thought through how do we design those tools, and the people that are using them or facilitating with them, they don't have meaning, or they're not going to resonate with people unless we've thought that through. So I wanted to offer this quote just to get me going here, everyone. Many of you will have heard of Maya Angelou before. She's a beautiful, amazing, talented writer. And I'm going to get her quote just a teeny bit wrong, everyone, but it sounds something like this. People might forget the things that you said. They might even forget the things that you do. And they rarely forget how you made them feel. And so for me, online engagement is two parts. It's both about what is the input, the feedback, the knowledge that we get from participants, but it's also about the experience that we leave behind. And at least in my work, that's really important because we're also talking about building trust and relationships. And trust and relationships come from that experience that we create for people. So just wanted to set the stage for all of these tools, anything that you choose, however you design, think about what is it that I'm leaving behind for people. This isn't just about getting input or taking from people, it's also about giving back and identifying that we're really grateful for people's participation. So here's what I wanted to tell you, I want to tell you a quick story and then give you a few tips. Recently, I've been doing some work up here in Canada with a caribou recovery task force. So this is something many of you might know in Northern Canada. We have a declining population of caribou. And caribou are one of those species that when caribou are not in sync, then we also know that there's a lot of other environmental impacts that are happening. There's sort of a capstone species that helps us pay attention or helps us understand. Now, there might be many of you on the line who are ecologists. By no means, everyone, do I know a lot about caribou, but I do know that they matter and they tell us a lot about the environment around us. This was a task force that came together and that was in charge of figuring out in a consensus-based way, how do we ensure that caribou recovers, that other species continue to have experience growth and diversity. There's ability for Indigenous people to access traditional harvesting, that the energy sector and economy continues to grow, and that many of these rural populations and communities have an opportunity to recreate and enjoy their spaces. So you can imagine that those are a lot of diverse needs. We've got economy, we've got environment, we've got social and human issues all mixed in together. And so this task force was intended to come together to solve that, or at least to come up with recommendations for what does a working landscape look like. Everyone, we'd spent a few months together, meeting probably about 4 times, and then COVID happened. And we were scheduled to meet 2 weeks after sort of I will call it the big, like, we need to slow down, we need to stop meeting in person, we need to flatten the curve happened. Now, we reached out to our participants and said, let's check in with you. How are you doing? Are you, in a place of where you can continue to participate? And all of our task force members came back overwhelmingly said, yes, we've been doing this work. It continues to matter. We want to keep going with it, even with this challenge that is in front of us. So then it promptly went, so Kim, how are we going to meet online? Like, what does that look like if we can't come together? And so here's my advice, everyone, to you. That was just one example of engagement that was ongoing. You probably have lots of other examples. But I always think of 3 things when I'm designing engagement. We want to think about the physical experience people have. We want to think about the intellectual experience people have. And we want to think about the emotional experience people have. And I'm going to speed up here just a little bit, everyone, because I want to ensure that Gina still has time to tell some of her great stories. Physical space, everyone. In the online arena, we have way less control over this than we used to. Normally, we could pick the room and the venue and the setup, and we don't have access to that anymore in the online space. And so we need to think about people's comfort and their convenience. Like, how easy is it for them to come online? And how are we going to ensure that they're comfortable in their own space when we don't have very much influence over that? So I'm going to give you a really practical example. At a minimum, when I bring people together online, I always invite them to say, let's take a look. Have you got some water? Have you got some snacks with you? Do you have what you need in order to be really comfortable and participate at your best? I'm working with another organization right now, and we're playing around with, is there any way we could somehow coordinate gift certificates to skip the dishes so that people could actually have food arrive at their home or at their place so that they could continue to participate and they had the sustenance in order to participate at their best. So again, these are all resource dependent, but that's one of the things that we've been thinking about. I want to talk just a little bit about the intellectual space, everyone. We're asking people to take a lot of detail, a lot of information, and process it online. So how are they going to make meaning? And we need to think about, how do we design for that? I want to lean into what Emily's doing right now, everyone. This is a great way to support people to make meaning. I'm talking so you can hear me. You can watch what Emily's doing in front of you, and potentially we could have even had some sort of recording device that all of you who are listening had a tactile way to interact. And so I just want you to think about when you're designing, when you're picking tools, how are we going to ensure people can think through the information, that they use those different learning, so whether they see or they hear or they do things with their hands. So we want to think about different ways that we can engage people to make a constructive intellectual space. Last but not least, everyone, and then it's time for me to stop talking, is that emotional space. Back to, how are people going to feel as a result of it? This is, one of the simplest and yet probably hardest things to do. So I'm going to give you a tangible example from my Caribou team. We'd come together for a couple of hours on our very first day, and oh, sorry, everyone, there was some loud noise there. There was a lot of people were starting to lose their energy. They were starting to sort of struggle with what was happening. And one of my participants came to the session with a hat on his head. And I went, I could react to this person having a random hat on their head, or I could create from this hat that's on someone's head. And we started off this bit of a challenge then for our task force going forward. So like every time we took a break, people would run around their house and come back with new hats. And some of them were Halloween costumes, some of them were baseball hats, some of them were all sorts of different things. Now, it sounds silly, everyone, and yet I often find that it's in the silly and it's in the light that we create connection between other people, such that when we get to the hard stuff, such that when we get to the complex, that we've got some connection to lean into to work through the difficult pieces. So I'm going to stop talking there, everyone. I'm going to turn it over to Gina. And what I really want you to remember is whatever tool you choose, whatever design you come up with, think through the physical experience, the intellectual experience, and the emotional experience. Put those pieces together and you will have a thoughtful design that will support you. All right, Gina, over to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Kim. Super interesting. And I love the hats. I may have to steal that. So what we also thought we wanted to talk about is, how do we deal with really complex issues and problem solving when people aren't sitting together in the room, able to, write on a whiteboard, look at each other across the face. So we are going to share a couple vignettes from different experiences that I've had in dealing with some complexity. So the first one involves complex problem solving across distance. And the project was the California Breast Cancer Research Program. And we basically had to shift a 2-day meeting that was a 2-day planning meeting with 35 national experts to an online forum. I'm going to go ahead and take the screen, if I may, Emily, so that I can share the information about this tool. Unfortunately, this tool I have to show statically just on some slides because it has a cost and a fee associated with every user. So the intent of our meeting was brainstorming, refining, and prioritizing research topics to prevent breast cancer for future funding consideration. And we had 35 researchers. So we chose 2 tools. The first tool is that we did a more kind of traditional presentation, but it was very highly stimulating and high impact. The second tool that we used was called Storms. This is it. Storms is an online platform. It's very highly structured, and it allows you to create a series of steps in the form of a workshop that allows participants to generate ideas, to add detail, to refine, and then also sort of a quiz ranking function that it helps folks to be able to prioritize and evaluate and rank in order to make some selections if they have to narrow their thinking. So as you can see here, this is an example where we had each one of these little white cards, if you will, is a potential research topic for breast cancer prevention that this group was generating. And they were able to generate ideas, to brainstorm ideas, and post them onto this platform. We could move them around and organize them across different topics. We had population level prevention, fundamental causes, so that they could be organized. And then the beauty of this was that each participant would be able to add detail and share ideas. So while we were talking online, people were able to be active, back to the physical component. They were able to be active and thinking and typing if that was the way that their brains process. Others were able to be solely verbal. And you can see here that they were able to add a description of what the topic was so that it was more than just a nameplate at the top. They were able to identify potential improvements for that topic in order to build it out and make it more meaningful and effective. And then lastly, they were able to raise concerns, we just called them cons, things that they thought for this topic to really be successful, it needed to be considered, the different cons. The other powerful component of this tool is that there are lots of options for ranking. And so we were able to establish a set of criteria in advance. And then each participant, when we narrowed down to our top 10 topics or so here, we're able to rank those by the criteria. And you might be asking, why is there a black line of 29 under this first blue topic? And the bar goes higher than that? we sometimes gave people in this particular ranking, we gave them the option to vote up to 3 points per topic if they loved it, but they could also vote something down 1 point. So when you see a bar extended beyond that number, you could find out, well, there was somebody here that really didn't like this. The details of those numbers aren't that important, but I just wanted to illustrate the breadth of the tool and its ability to help have different ways of filtering information to help people think about, well, how do we evaluate and how do we think about prioritizing to move forward? The last component of this element of this platform that I just want to speak to is the power of its prioritization function. In the last view, I showed you how they can evaluate and rank. And then in this view, I wanted to show you that in these 2 different areas, like let's look at the yellow segment, if you will. You can see that each one of these little white boxes are separate research topics. And as the group evolved in its thinking and its discussion, it was able to set aside those other topics. So those faded into the background. They didn't go away completely, but we would hide them from view. And so the group as a whole could continue evolving and thinking, well, how do we get down to 6 topics? What do we let go of? And so it just was incredibly powerful and effective for helping a group to problem solve and think together across distance. So I'm going to put one more chat and go to my second vignette. And if you go into the chat box, you will see another poll everywhere. And we are inviting you to share the innovative examples from your own online meetings. And we are going to ask you to, we're going to put those up on a scroll. And Emily, is it okay if I go ahead and go to that scroll, or do you want to wait a few minutes?
I'm not sure what your question means.
Can we go ahead and show the results of the poll for people sharing their innovative examples?
Yeah.
Or do you have a few things you want to show first?
I just want to be on my page that shows, are you going to share more? Do you want to share more of your I can do this in the background and then share it afterwards. How about that?
Okay, sounds great. So I'm going to encourage folks to share examples, 1 or more innovative examples from your own online meetings. And if you could include your name, it would be great, because we might come to you and invite you to talk a little bit about that in just a minute. So the next example that I wanted to talk about in my vignette is the idea of socializing innovation and networking across distance. And this project was around sea level rise guiding principles. Some of you may have even been on this meeting. And there were 17 state agencies. And the tools that we chose for this were Poll Everywhere, which you're going to see right here. And then also Zoom Meeting, not the Zoom webinar. So we had 17 state agency executives who drafted principles to guide all of their agencies' work on sea level rise. And the goal of the meeting was for the staff to be able to know who's doing innovative things, who has initiatives, and to encourage staff to sort of lead on sea level rise. We ended up having 120 people online from the staff, as well as 17 agencies, executives. And the first choice that we made, actually at the very last minute, because I participated in a webinar, is that we decided not to use Zoom webinar. We used a Zoom meeting, because one of our primary goals was for the staff to get to know who was doing what, where, and to get to know one another. So by doing a Zoom meeting, everyone was able to see the participant list. We invited people to add their organization or their agency name. And so it gave another opportunity for people to chat with one another, see who was doing innovation, and the Zoom meeting over the webinar allowed us to have that functionality. The second thing that we did is we used Poll Everywhere, and you can see it here. And I'd really encourage people to hop on that chat and click through on the link and share a couple of innovative things that you've done. We use this for two purposes. One is we did it to curate questions because we had a very compressed time frame. And so 2 people followed the chat, followed the poll, and then they just articulated questions for different speakers. But the second thing that we did is what we're doing right here, which is that we invited people to share their own innovation and to talk about that as part of our group. And so that, in that regard, people learned so much more about what was innovative and what was going on around the whole state on the topic. And so what we'd like to do here is just hear from you all a couple of ideas. And we invite you to raise your hand on Zoom if you're able to do that. Sarah, are you still there?
Sorry, I was on mute. Yes, I'm here.
So are people able to raise their hand so we could take them off mute if we'd like, and invite some of them to share any ideas that they might have about their innovation?
Yeah, looking for raised hands.
Looking for raised hands. I see Natalie Hernandez from Climate Resolve had a DJ. I don't know, Natalie, if you want to just come off mute for a second and speak about that, it would be great.
Sure, and I'll start my video if you can see me.
Yeah.
There was a conference put on by Green Lining a couple weeks ago, and during the break, because I think even today we haven't had music, but they had a live DJ, and so the spotlight video would go towards the DJ, and it was just a fun type of way to take a break and dance.
I love that. That is so great.
Gina, do you mind if I jump? Oh, sorry, Gina. And everyone, I just gotta say, there's so many great ideas happening in Poll Everywhere. So keep them coming, everyone. Feel free to keep throwing some ideas in here. Everyone, I just wanted to share one. It just came up last Thursday, facilitating a session for, many of you know that May is Caregivers Month. Caregivers are people, generally unpaid people who look after friends or families or neighbors due to illness or disability. And we had a moment where I had asked everyone, I said, I just want everyone to stop for a moment. We were having a really very emotional conversation and invited everyone just to stop and say, this is the moment right now normally where someone would, touch your shoulder, or someone would give you a hug, or someone would connect with you. We can't do that online, but I'm just gonna invite everyone to stop and just feel it. Like whatever you need right now, believe that it's coming your direction. And it was a moment of silence, and yet it was a moment of connection all at the same time. And we'd never done anything like that online before, and it was new and different for me. So I wanted to share that one. Gina, back over to you.
Great. I see Alex from the Sierra Nevada Conservancy. How did you started early and had a coffee in advance? Alex, do you want to speak to how that had an impact on your group?
Okay, Alex Vance, right? Not Alice Cardenas?
Alex Vance.
Okay, it's my first time to unmute someone. Alex, you are on.
Sure. So yeah, it was, we had just a lot of people who didn't know each other, and really the main purpose of the whole workshop was social time and networking. We built tons of it into the agenda, and we then had to move to this Zoom meeting setting, and each morning we just invited people to come 30 minutes early, bring their coffee, and talk. And it was a little awkward at first, but people loosened up pretty quickly, and we saw people building relationships, reconnecting with old friends. So it was nice. I didn't know how it would go, but it actually worked out really well.
Great. Thank you so much, Alex. That's great. I'm just trying to see. I clicked on
I'm ready for someone else. I know how to do it now.
I'm just looking at the queue here to see. Someone mentioned I think we could these are great ideas and we really appreciate them. I'm going to go ahead and pass it on, and we'll come back and open up at the end for a few more shared ideas from all of you. So next we're going to go ahead and pass it to Emily. Emily, we are there was already a question in the chat about what is she doing and how is she doing that. So I think people are super curious to hear a little bit more about the work you do and what you're able to do online.
Got it. Stand by. Let me stop that and start over. Sometimes sharing is persnickety. So let's try it again. There it is. Okay, so this is where I was. And now let's go from that. We'll close that and open this other one. Okay, great. Hey, everybody. Okay, so we're going to talk about graphic recording. So you've gotten to experience what that looks like as I am taking these live real-time meeting notes. And you can see how the live notes are messier than the pre-populated images that I drew before the session. And I want to share with you 3 things that I believe graphic recording can do to support an innovative online session. So the first thing is that it engages people. So as similar to what Kim said earlier, it is helping to keep people focused because it's giving us 2 channels to take in the information. So we've got a visual channel and we've got the auditory channel. So as we watch something being written or drawn, it reinforces what we are hearing. The second thing I have here is that it shows people that they are heard. And so often, you know, if we have a conversation and it's not captured, it just one thought moves on to the next and it just poof, poof, things evaporate and your comment might not be acknowledged. You might not feel like it really landed, but by capturing the key nugget and the distilled point that somebody makes, and for me, when I do that, I always pull out their own words, just the essence of what they said. And then when I put that up on the big group chart, it visually demonstrates that we're listening and that person's point was heard and their contribution was valued because there it is on the chart as we're going. And then I just to share, you know, I've been doing this work I'm in my 20th year, and one of my favorite things in a meeting in real life was always to notice the change that happened when people saw that their points made it onto the big board. So this really connects to this build rapport and build trust, because I would turn over my shoulder as I'm drawing on my big mural sheet of paper, and I could see people just kind of go, oh, okay, wow. They feel their whole body, the language would relax. And my story about that is really that it would seem that people were feeling like, oh, you are taking this seriously. You actually want to know what I think. Okay, cool. So that's the second. And the third one that I want to talk about is I really feel like it boosts our brain power. So this is because we've taken all this content out of all our individual brains and we've put it into this shared external working space, right? And we've made all our work and our process tangible, and we can see what we're talking about. And because we have everything up there, we don't have to use our brain power to try to remember what was said 2 hours ago or 20 minutes ago or even 30 seconds ago. We don't have to be processing all that because we've got a record of it, a real-time record that's being built. And so because of that, we can instead use our fabulous brain power to do the important work, to do the sorting and the prioritizing and to look for patterns and connections to make decisions, etc. And then finally, any kind of a picture or image is much stickier for our brains to hang on to than typewritten text. And when I say picture, I'm also including handwritten words because they're all different. They show up as images for our brain. So that also helps us to remember things, as well as the spatial orientation when you have things on a chart. And we kind of, it's like we remember the information spatially, just like as you look at this chart here, you remember we have on the left, engaging people, in the center, showing people they're heard, and on the right, boosts our brain power. So finally, I wanted to just share, like, reveal behind the curtain, and this is the how, in the bottom left here. How I'm working right now is I have my iPad down here. It's what I've been looking down at, and I have my stylus to write on the iPad. And then I'm sharing my screen in Zoom, and what you're seeing is my iPad open to a drawing app. And this drawing app, so this drawing app is called Procreate, and it only costs $10. So it's not a big subscription. There is the outlay, of course, of buying an iPad, but I think the power of it can be really quite something. And if you want to start in a more simple way, to think about another way you could do this is to use Zoom Meeting, and you could draw in the Zoom whiteboard area. So just like now I'm sharing my screen, another option in Zoom for sharing is to share the whiteboard. Again, it helps if you are drawing with a stylus on a tablet, but I would really suggest having somebody in your session that does some kind of visual notes. No matter how simple, they still have power and sticking points. So that's it for me.
Thanks, Emily. Now, Sarah, we're getting very close to the end of our time. So Sarah, do we want to maybe just open up to a few questions? I'm going to look to you for some guidance.
Yes, let's go to questions. So team, Jessica, Amy, Veronica, Marta, anyone have questions you want to raise up?
One question on the chat is, they want to thank you. It was great. Is the drawing as beautiful, the app, does it make drawing as beautiful as yours on the app?
She said yes.
Absolutely.
I do see there's a question coming in the chat box. Are there any tools or templates? Now, everyone, for just getting started for graphic recording, Emily is clearly a pro, everyone. I mean, she does beautiful, insightful work. I do know that there's lots of like graphic facilitation 101 courses that are out there. And there's like little cards that you can buy that help you get started in doing something like this. Emily, what would you add to that?
No, I was just doing the shameless plug. Yeah, no, I'm working on an online class right now that's more about just how to make a flip chart and how to do a list and a mind map and a cluster diagram. It's not even about drawing. It's really about arranging words in space. So that's an online class. It's going to be coming soon. You can see more about it on my website. But I'll think more about other resources I could add in.
Emily, can you make sure to put your website in the chat?
Yes, I will do that.
Great. Anyone want to lift any other questions up?
Yes, in the Q&A, we have a question from Andrea, and she asks, how can we work to ensure that we help people speak within time limitations? How do you conduct a listening session, but also manage the webinar?
Such a good question. Gina, do you want to take a first crack at it and I'll add some stuff in?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's not, that different than when we do our in-person meetings. We have to create some space and time for people to engage and think expansively when they're talking, but at the same time, really set expectations for when it's time to sort of start narrowing down or moving toward closure. And then I'm not sure I totally understand the second part of your question of how to conduct a listening session, but also manage the webinar. But I'm just wondering if you're thinking about juggling both. And I would just say that often when we are on a webinar, just like Sarah and her team are modeling today, that there is a team of us, one person concentrated on what people are sharing and saying, and another person who is managing the logistics, helping people with their technical issues, answering questions in the chat. because it's really too much for any one person to do all of that together.
The only thing that I would add in, everyone, to or offer in addition to what Gina said, when I've brought people together and it's intended to be a, I'll call it a hearing and be heard type of session, you know, where we've got people who are listening as well as people who are participating. I really love the question, and this would go for an in-person session just like online. I ask people at the beginning, so what do you need from me as your session leader to participate at your best? What do you need from others who are on the call today? And what do you need from yourself? And then we do a bit of, I mean, it's a classic way to gather ground rules, but whoever wants to create ground rules, like nobody wants rules to follow, but rather like, what is the container that we are going to co-create together? And I find that that series of questions, what do you need from me as your session leader? What do you need from others? What do you need from yourself in order to participate at your best? Starts to bring out some of those things. So then as the session leader, you can offer things or suggestions based on what participants have said. And it feels less like, I'm sorry, you've used up your 2 minutes, you must stop talking now. It becomes a more relaxed ebb and flow. So I might throw that into the mix as well.
I have a couple questions, Sarah, if I can just jump in and answer them. So
I have one too.
There's a couple that have come through that I want to mention. But before I go to that, Emily, because I know you're busy recording, someone was wanting to know, do you have to have a tablet for this graphic recording? And I know you mentioned you could use Zoom.
Sorry, there's a chainsaw right outside my window, so I'm on mute. It does really help to have a tablet for the online graphic recording because you are writing. And it's just really, it's kind of impossible to do that with a mouse. I mean, I suppose you could still get some of that value typing things in boxes and making them sort of like Post-it notes that you move around, which I know you can do in the Zoom whiteboard. So that even that would help to have things spatial and grouped to help us sort things. But typically for the things that are handwritten, yes, a tablet and a pen.
So a couple questions I wanted to just pick up that I saw in the Q&A is there a way to do like Post-its where everybody's contributing? I know that I've used IdeaFlip and it works relatively well. I don't love it, but I would caution if you have more than like 25 people that it can be a bit overwhelming, which is why we chose Poll Everywhere today instead, because it had a scrolling function. And then someone on the innovation, the Poll Everywhere said that they use Trello, Trello, as a flip chart. And so with that, I'll pass it back to you, Sarah, for some more questions. And then if we have time, I might highlight a couple other fun things that people shared with innovation. Or maybe I could just share my screen for a few minutes to Emily. Go ahead, Sarah.
I have a question for you all. What is your advice for someone right now who's thinking, well, this is pretty cool, but I'm pretty nervous to try it, and what if it doesn't work? And then my boss and all my colleagues, when they said, that's too risky. What if it doesn't go right? We're all gonna look stupid, and then we're gonna get criticized. What's your advice to overcome that?
Practice, practice, practice. I really think, you know, I'm sure others have ideas too, but like I'm finding planning my online meetings takes even as much or more time than my in-person, because I really have to think everything through so carefully and manage all of that. So that's my feedback. Practice, practice, practice.
And what I would layer in with what Gina offered everyone, practice, practice, practice. And 2 parts. I think authenticity, like when you come on the call, when you say things like, you know, everyone, this is a new and different way that we are convening. We are living through unprecedented times. We really want to acknowledge your willingness to come try this out with us. And we're learning just like you're learning. So there's going to be some things that go really smooth today, and there might be some things that don't go as well today. And there's something about naming it where you bring participants along with you. My other favorite activity, so just really genuine, authentic, like we're giving it our best. We've practiced a ton, and we invite you to learn with us as we go. The second part that I would offer on the, can we take a risk is I love playing the game in our planning table of what's the worst possible thing we could actually imagine going wrong? And then getting everyone to say it out loud, because sometimes the fear that we have is bigger than our head than it actually is. And our heart feels a whole lot better after we've named it, talked about it, probably come up with some mitigation strategies, and then we feel more comfortable to move on. So 2 parts. There's the in the moment, how are you going to support risk? And there's that, how do we support our decision makers or our leaders to feel comfortable with it? So those are a couple of suggestions.
Go for it, Gina.
I just put in the chat for those of you, because I noticed in some of the innovation examples, there were a couple people who were like, innovation, I'm just trying to do it, get started. And so I did put just in the chat a link to a really short blog piece that we did at CBI on sort of 10 tips. It's really basic, but it's just kind of that what you do, what to avoid, to kind of get you started and get the basics underway. Let's see, Emily, I'm going to go back to you if you want to share your screen again. We've kind of looked at the different poll everywheres. Is there any other questions or anything, Sarah, before we wrap? I can look too.
Okay, sorry, I was on mute. We have time. Let's take one more question. So Veronica, Amy, Jessica, anyone want to lift up one more question before we begin to say thank you?
There was no Spanish. This is Veronica in the Q&A or in the chat.
Okay. Jessica?
There are no more questions in the Q&A or in the chat. People are just asking for Emily's website, and we'll post it one more time into the chat.
Great. Okay, so then let's see. I think I can post a poll even though you all have the screen. Is there anything you all would like to say as a closing remark before? I mean, maybe, you know what, let's, back to what you're saying, Cam, of let's just be transparent. So we've been, the one thing that's come to mind for me when you talked about the different things you could try and being open and sincere that you're trying new things is I think one of the approaches for this conference has been what I think of as baby steps. So on the first day, we didn't want to, unmute any of the participants because we were nervous, but by the third day, I think we felt more confident to do that. And we talked a lot about using additional, I don't know if you call them add-on tools like Poll Everywhere, Gina, but then we were kind of like, we've never done a conference like this and it's a lot of people. So let's just stick with the Zoom polls. We made these like kind of baby step choices. So before I go to like our potentially simple poll, do you guys have maybe a kind of deeper question that we could wrap up with so that people could share in the chat their big takeaways or what they learned?
Maybe, how about this, Sarah? I'm going to offer a really simple one, but it often elicits lots from people. I would love for you to share in the chat box, everyone, right now. It's my ultimate favorite question. What's the one thing that you're walking away with now that you didn't have when we started the session 40, 50-ish minutes ago? So what's the one thing that you're walking away with now that you didn't have when we started the session? And I'll offer one, and then I'll invite my colleagues to offer the same thing. I think I knew this coming in, but looking at the chat and listening to some of our colleagues here, the thing that continues to resound with me is innovation is no longer a luxury. kind of pre-COVID, it was sort of this sense of like, it'd be great if we tried something new, but maybe we weren't pushed or we didn't have to do something different. And so while this has been, a scary and different world and sort of engaging in uncertainty, I am grateful. And what I'm learning is innovation is no longer a luxury. We got to push, we got to deepen, we need to richen in the different ways that we're engaging. So that's the one thing that I'm walking away with. Gina, how about over to you?
Yeah, I'm just looking at people's questions in the chat and the things that they got away, that they took from it too. I mean, I feel like in some ways my social life has become somewhat flat, like a screen. It's just been a real struggle in that regard. I mean, I'm a facilitator, so obviously I like people, but I didn't really realize how much energy I got from that. And so I would take some small risk, that's my takeaway in response to Sarah, start small. I just responded to somebody about large public meetings. Don't overdo it. You know what I mean? But start somewhere and try something, different and new. Like the other day I did an equity workshop online, and at the end I got everybody to take themselves off mute at the exact same time. Kim, I got this idea from you, and just had them shout out their thank yous and have a great weekend, because it was just so flat, and we were talking about something so poignant and in a society struggling so much with that. So just take a few risks, maybe one at a time, and see how it goes.
Awesome.
So before we wrap up, we do have one more question we want to ask. Natalie, do you want to say it?
No, I'm good.
Okay.
Yes.
Natalie, her name is one last question, and then we'll wrap up.
Right, and I had just seen it come through the chat, and I know others have seen it too, but how do we address bilingual needs when writing on the whiteboard? And since today we have the live interpretation, I think this is really important to address.
Mm-hmm. I'm going to take a stab at it, and then Gina, feel free to jump in. We wrestled with this for a long time, like create static slides, easy to translate, doesn't create the same experience, but potentially what we're doing right now is creating a barrier. So a couple of things that come to mind, everyone. If we could go back and do it all over again, potentially we could have talked to our translators and said, can you also, like in addition to translating content verbally coming out, also share some of what is coming out on the screen? And probably as much as possible, we make it graphic, or like as many graphics as we possibly can, which I'm sure Emily would tell us is tricky to do in real time right in the moment. But again, sort of less words, more graphics, because graphics speak 1,000 different languages. Gina, what else might you offer?
I actually think it'd be interesting to hear Emily's thoughts. I'm going to pass to her.
Yeah, I haven't done this myself, but some of my colleagues have been in situations where they have been, we call it tandem recording, where there's two people working on one chart, and I've done it more in real life. So I've done it with another person, but you can also do it where a friend of mine did it when he was in China, and he was graphic recording in English, and his colleague was graphic recording in Chinese. And so so it takes a little pre-work, to Gina's point, but I think it is doable, and I'm really passionate about more people learning this skill so that they can, we can share it and have more communities have the skills themselves to use this and have many languages represented.
Great. Okay, well, thank you so much, Emily, Gina, and Kim. This was an absolute treat. I hate to take down your beautiful work, Emily, but I am going to go ahead and take the screen back. There we go. Because I am very excited to introduce Yana, our closing speaker. Yana, give me just a moment. Oh. Okay, and here we are. So, Yana, let's see. Let me just test your mic. And thank you again, Kim, Emily, and Gina. I don't see you, Yana.
Do you see me now?
There we go. Okay, fantastic. So It is my pleasure to introduce Yana Garcia, the Deputy Secretary for Environmental Justice, Tribal Affairs, and Border Relations at Cal EPA for our closing remarks of our 3-day conference. Go for it, Yana.
Thanks, Sarah. Thank you very much. Good afternoon, all. Thank you for joining us and for making it through to the end of our conference. For those of you who might have struggled with the concept of joining for 3 days of online engagement, I just want to congratulate you on making it through. I'm incredibly grateful to have had the opportunity to join the sessions over the past few days. Not all, but those that I've joined have been incredible. And I'm very honored to have been able to support this work. I really want to recognize each and every one of you who envisioned, contributed to, participated in the past few days. Just you made this conference possible. Your thoughts, your questions, and the energy that you brought to the past couple of days, and we deeply, deeply appreciate that. Now, as many have throughout the conference, I also just want to take a moment as we conclude here to honor those who have walked this land before us and who are still with us today, as well as the countless lives that have been taken from us, in particular during the past few months. Now, I'm in Oakland, so I'll take the next few seconds to honor the Ohlone people of this land and all of those who have been killed at the hands of police and through race-driven violence, as well as the coronavirus, whose presence is still with us, and I invite you to join me for the next few seconds in doing so. Thank you. Now, I've been relieved, as I'm sure many of you have been too, to have a space where we can recognize the connection between the topic that brings us all together here and the deep racism that we see going on around us, not just today and not just because of any single factor, although police violence is the most egregious, but because of the multiple ways in which racial inequities continue to drive all of our institutions. We need to continue to voice the injustice to George Floyd, to continue to say his name and the names of so many others. And it's critical to have some of our senior leaders, cabinet members across our state, speak to the loss of his life, as some have during this conference. And I just want to acknowledge again how grateful I am that we've been able to be a part of that. Now, there's so much about what's going on right now that pulls us away from our humanity and from our collective capacity. I hope that through the past few days, we can use the energy that we've collected here to remind ourselves of our own power and our ability to shape an equitable recovery from the crises affecting us today and to build a future that is better than our past. Now, this brings us to our goal. I want to make sure that we all come away from these 3 days energized and connected to move forward with lessons learned and next steps. So Sarah, if you could take it away with some prompts for ideas from folks.
Thank you. Okay. I am going to try to open the poll. So the first question that we are going to ask is, how beneficial have you found the online environmental engagement conference overall? I'm going to just take a little bit of time to let folks participate. Yana, I feel like it's pretty cool when you lean forward like that. Through the mirror behind you, we can see you at your computer. Very cool. Okay. I think most of the folks who are going to vote have voted, so I'm going to end the poll and share the results. So look at that. Almost everyone says between extremely beneficial and very beneficial. That is absolutely wonderful. We're all so pleased to hear that. Okay, I'm going to do one more before we go into a couple more questions. Training. So this question has to do with training. Choose the top 3 topics government staff need training in. So if you are a government staffer, your opinion, and if you are not a government staffer, what do you think government staff should get trained in? And our options are cultural competency, language access laws and policies, contracting for effective language services, community engagement generally, civil rights laws and policies, and racial equity. We realize there are lots more topics than we are listing here, but we thought this would give a quick sense of your thoughts. Okay, another minute. Nice. We're having great participation. And those of you who are watching us through the webcast, we're so glad you're here. And whatever your thoughts are in response to this, would you please use our email and send us your 2, or you can even do 3 top responses in the Gmail, which is engagewithus2020@gmail.com. So I'm now going to share this poll. Okay, wow. So look at this. Okay, 66% community engagement. 65% a very close second with cultural competency, and then racial equity. Look at those top 3. That's amazing. And then a huge number between language access laws and contracting for language services, which I think of as pretty darn connected. This is very helpful, isn't it, Yana?
This is incredible.
Yeah. Okay. So now, everyone I feel like is all warmed up because of the Kim, Gina, Emily session. We would like everyone to open your chat. If you're on the webcast, we would like you to open an email. And I have 2 questions for you. I'm going to give you the first one. One takeaway from this whole conference, if you were just going to say this is what was most, maybe it was just connecting with folks, whatever your biggest takeaway from the conference is, please share that right now. Let me give you a second before I hit you with the second question. Let's see what we've got. And we want everyone to participate. This is that moment that someone like me in an in-person thing would be running around with a microphone, putting it in the face of the person who looks like they don't really want to talk. And I want them to anyways. Okay, let's see here. Appreciate the use of different platforms, challenges facing communities, language access, heartened to see government workers like me are as interested in this, inspiration. Grateful for the sharing. This is fantastic. Rethinking meeting design, language access. Gina, I don't know if you see this, how Judy Talbot is part of this. Hi, Judy. Haven't seen you in a long time. Okay, I'm going to ask our second question. So if you've submitted this, you can get going on the second one. And then after, just, after this, I'm going to be turning things back over to Yana. Just a few more thoughts to share before we wrap up. So our second question is about action. And we want you to think about an action that you're willing to commit to post this conference. So everyone's in different places. We're always talking about self-care. So I'm thinking on a spectrum. If it's just, you're gonna look up a link because that's something you can commit to in the next couple weeks, or if it's, I'm really gonna invest in learning how to be a graphic recorder like Emily, whatever a tangible action you are comfortable committing to, let's say in the next 2 months, please try not to be too shy. I know it can be hard to put yourself in a vulnerable way out in public, but whatever you're comfortable sharing in the chat, an action you will commit to. I'm going to give it just a few seconds for those to start coming in, and then Yana, we are going to be coming back to you.
Great.
And I'm stopping the poll so it isn't covering your face. It's always awkward when the poll covers the speaker's face.
Oh, that's fine. I don't mind.
All right. Okay, we see I got a graphic recording attempt, follow-up training with diverse community engagement, share resources with coworkers, getting language access training as a bilingual employee, using the mapping tool to look at communities to engage with, making a bigger effort with plain language, doing DJing or having a DJ or doing music during breaks. I want to copy that too. Okay, so Yana, why don't we let these keep rolling in, and let me go back to you.
Sure. And I'm happy to share my maybe top 2 takeaways from the conference. And these are reminders that I really want to take forward in my own work. As Sarah mentioned, I focus on environmental justice issues at the California Environmental Protection Agency, tribal affairs, and California-Mexico border relations. So much of what's been discussed is really relevant to the work that I do with so many of the folks who have supported this program. A couple things that I took away are, first, partnerships matter, which we know, but we have to remind ourselves of all the time. They make all the difference in the world and are more important now than they ever have been. I think we see this in the importance of allyship across communities, coming together to support each other, to stand in solidarity and partnership with one another. We've seen this through the formation and execution of this very conference. This 3-day program could not have come together without interagency partnership, without resources across Cal EPA and the Resources Agency, and the beautiful collaboration that happened across our staff. We also know that we can't make it out of this current crisis without continued partnership and people power. And people power really requires us to build across non-governmental groups, governmental groups, broad coalitions, smaller coalitions, small businesses, residents across the state and across the country. Now, the range of participants here in this very conference shows us that. We have consultants, grassroots leaders, public health professionals, environmental agencies from Delaware to Alaska. It's really incredible and just shows that we have to continue the work to reject othering and division and come together in solidarity. Now, the second reminder for me is that expertise is always on the ground. It's always at the grassroots level. And while we often associate the term expert with academic credentials, which I don't mean to dismiss, when it comes to building the practical tools we need to engage and mobilize the public, it's practitioners, it's advocates, residents, and community leaders who are the true experts and the true innovators. Now, in the environmental movement, we constantly have to remind other experts of this fact. And based on the past few days, I am more committed than ever to uplifting the expertise of our communities across our state. Now, I want to leave some time for Q&A, but I just want to do a couple of reminders, walk through a couple of reminders from the messages from our secretary and undersecretary. Now, at Cal EPA, during this time, we are all looking at different strategies to continue our work and to continue our protection and enhancement of the environment and public health. I just want to reiterate that we remain committed to providing clean air and clean water to California communities across the state. And we need your partnership and your feedback to help that be possible. We hear from many of you often and want to continue to hear from you about how we're delivering on this promise, how we're delivering on these commitments and on these missions. And we want to continue that moving forward. We want to continue our grant making. We have limited resources again, but we have grant making programs that are small and make a really big difference for the dollars that we're able to dole out. We run an environmental justice small grants program, which I strongly encourage those of you in California to look into. If you need information on that, please feel free to reach out to some of the conference organizers, including me. Feel free to look at our website and we'd be happy to follow up with you on information there. And then finally, we really want to focus on our community science and community-driven incident reporting. We have many ways in which we gather information from the public that requires either members of the public to come to Sacramento and to come to our meetings, or that require our staff to go out into communities, and we're really wanting to enhance some of the technological tools that we have available to make online reporting of incidents possible. We know that incidents keep happening. We know that while we're wanting to leverage some of the pollution reductions that we've seen. They've been very limited, and we obviously do not want to see them in this fashion, but we want to be able to understand where pollution incidents are continuing to happen so that we can respond to them, and so that ultimately we can continue to protect public health. Now, I know that the cost of online engagement often came up throughout this conference, and the cost of, I think, many things is front of mind for a lot of us right now. So I also want to reiterate and share as a best practice, I hope, the importance of staying committed to risk and vulnerability indicators that drive our investment of resources. At Cal EPA and across many state government agencies, we use a tool called Cal EnviroScreen, which really takes into account cumulative health and pollution burdens. But I can't emphasize enough how much of a difference it makes to prioritize based on risk and vulnerability where we should be focusing any of our investments, programmatic investments, financial investments, investments of time and resources. During the coronavirus and given where we are today, I think we also need to lead this prioritization with race. We need to look at ways in which the inputs to our policies and the outputs to our policies, who is at the table, how the policies are being designed, and who is at the impact and how those impacts are being felt by communities of color. We need to be able to track that information. And again, we need partnership in order to do that. So I want to invite all of you to continue that work with us. We are committed to moving forward in that. And this conference has really solidified that commitment. Now, in that spirit, I will just go through very quickly some of the other commitments we made for follow-up. We will be posting all presentation materials. We're going to be posting recordings and sharing contact information for speakers. I want to reiterate, this is a network that we don't want to lose. We really want to continue the momentum we've built here. I really want to just give a big kudos to those of you who organized this conference again. Sarah, that includes you. Deldi, that's you too. Ana Mascareñas, who you all worked with on the concept, and countless others who I hope have been thanked, but there is a long list of folks that really made this possible, and I just couldn't possibly express more gratitude to all of you. Thank you. And I think we have some time for questions and answers, so I'm happy to turn to that.
Okay, Yana, do you see the screen of all the folks on the team, the slide?
I do.
Oh, good. Okay, fantastic. So can I ask my colleagues, Tish, I know that you had a question from Gmail. Would you like to lift that one up? Or Jessica, or anyone who's monitoring the Q&A, question that you want to share with Yana?
Hi, yeah, from Gmail, reducing barriers to engagement with remote participation versus formal meetings that were our previous mode of input, language interpretation, requesting engagement. Could we ever get inmate participation?
That's a very good question. And actually, I've been in this role for almost 3 years, and I think that's maybe at most the second time that I've received that question. I think that's really ripe for exploration. I don't see, one of the things that we've been able to do recently with a lot of meetings that used to require, in-person presence, in particular in Sacramento, and because of that have led to a certain privilege for those organizations, advocacy groups, entities that have lobbyists in Sacramento. We've been able to open meetings now that were not previously open to people who weren't able to appear in person, to others across the state, and that's made a huge impact so far on at least a few meetings that we've held. I think, moving a recommendation forward that would help to push for participation among our incarcerated community would be wonderful, and I'd be happy to explore that further.
Yana, I saw one question asking for a little more explanation about the EJ small grants. I bet some of our participants haven't heard of those before.
Sure. So our EJ Small Grants program is a $1.5 million annual program. We award $50,000 grants. The eligibility requirements are to be a 501c3 or a federally recognized tribal government. And I want to just note that we fund a number of our tribes who may lack federal recognition status through their 501c3 status, if they're organized or have a nonprofit sponsor. For smaller organizations, the same. If you have a fiscal sponsor, a nonprofit sponsor, you're also an eligible entity to receive project funds. The design of the program is really to help smaller organizations get projects off the ground. We're really looking at projects that contribute to reducing and eliminating pollution burdens in disadvantaged communities across our state. Although I do want to emphasize, you do not have to be a disadvantaged community for SB 535 purposes, for Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund purposes. That's a very specific designation. You have to fall within the top 25% under Cal EnviroScreen. For our EJ Small Grants, you don't necessarily have to meet that criteria, but you have to show that you're contributing somehow to reducing pollution that affects low-income communities. Some of our projects, actually, as we're on the topic of addressing challenges that impact our incarcerated community members, are actually focused in prisons. We have a number of prison garden projects that we've funded over time through the Insight Garden Project. Those have been in San Quentin at their inception and now elsewhere throughout the state. So strongly encourage you all to take a look at our website and get more information, or we can send that to you as needed.
Great. Maybe one more question. Would someone on our team like to share any other questions?
I'm seeing a question here on Cal EnviroScreen that I'm happy to answer.
Okay.
Cal EnviroScreen is wonderful. However, some data seems dated. Yes, there are plans to make it more live and refresh it more. So we're not necessarily going to be refreshing it more often, I'd say. Part of the challenge that we have with using, well, we have census tract data, which I think is a benefit, but we are sort of on the census schedule of updates for some of the data that relies on census data. We will be looking at an update in this calendar year. And so we welcome your continued communication, participation in the process there. We hope, and I don't want to make any hardline commitments just because we're all dealing with life on a day-to-day basis here. But we're hoping to be able to release a draft update to this tool in the fall and to have a few online workshops, which we're all learning from here on how best to do that in the fall after that's released. So probably late fall and hopefully finalize before the end of the calendar year. So certainly invite you to stay tuned on that.
Great.
Any other questions?
Well, maybe while we're waiting for one last question, I was thinking I would like to do one other thank you. And Del D, I'm wondering if you're up for turning on your video and unmuting yourself. I personally just want to thank Del D so much. You have been such an amazing partner to work with, and this it's been a lot of work to put this on, but it's been so gratifying. And the way I've gotten to know this amazing group of people from 17 agencies. And I already knew Grace and Natalie because we all work together, but to be reconnected, it's been so special. And Del D, I was thinking you in your own voice would probably want to thank people and also acknowledge Amy.
I would love to do that. Thank you, Sarah. I really would appreciate that. So I would just want to say to everyone that everyone on the team, it was such a big vision that we heard about from Sarah and Ana Mascareñas, our colleague, around why this particular moment in time we needed to figure out how to. And going back to Kim's remarks about starting small, we initially thought that we could pull it off in May, and then we came to our senses. And one of the best pieces of wisdom we heard from one of our collaborators was Adriana Renteria, who said, after we decided to push it back a few weeks, she said, oh, that's such a great idea. Now we can be much more intentional about it. And she was right. And so it did give us some more time to do things better. Through Sarah, your amazing network of contacts and friends, we have pulled in such high quality caliber speakers from all across the country, including Canada, outside of the country. And then of course, with our own deep connections with environmental justice communities, as Yana was saying, we were able to tap the expertise in the field from the grassroots communities. And I think what was so inspiring about this conference is we brought those voices together. I learned so much from everything that I heard. I also learned what it's, for me, my own lesson about being a team player and being, wanting to do my very best to support everybody who's worked so hard on this. And I think we all sort of came to feel like that. I think trying to do that in this moment of crisis, having this conference to work on and to work for gave us something that was very positive and a bright light. And I know none of us want that light to go out. And so we are going to redouble our efforts to follow up and meet the commitment we shared with you of posting the recordings and finding ways to use the recordings and keeping that network going, as Yana talked about. I want to especially mention the 17 people who helped put these sessions together from every just like we're talking about what it takes to make online meetings work, no task is too small because if the slightest little thing that could go wrong will go wrong. And that is why every single one of you, and you know who I'm talking to, who had a role in making the sessions work today and yesterday and the day before, we could not have done this without you. Thank you so much. And finally, I want to say my last words of gratitude to Carlos Diaz and Luisa Diaz and Andrew Monroy. They have provided the most professional translation and interpretation to support this conference. So many of the themes that we talked about today were about language and access, and they were there making that possible for us. Thank you.
Thank you, Deldy. I thought of one more person we could have added to our list, and I didn't think of it, which is Chris at the Resources Agency, and I can't think of his last name right now. He was amazing making all the web page, and we kept being like, here's a new version, and that was amazing too. And James, special thank you to you. All right, Yana, close us out.
Well, I'm not sure that there's much more we can say than that. I mean, I think the collaboration that made this happen is really just so indicative of where we need to go. What kind of momentum, what kind of energy, human capacity we have, and what can come of that, what we can build. And I just want to say that I really hope that even our just cross-agency collaboration here can be continued. I think we make a world of progress when we're able to come together and share resources, share brain power, share our energy, our collective thought. And it does not escape me that most of these folks who have come together for this really also focus on programs that bring benefit to low-income communities and communities of color across our state. And there unfortunately need to be more of us. I think there need to be more of us across both institutions, across all of our institutions statewide. And so for those of you who maybe have not been engaged in work like this in the past or who want to join our racial equity work, I also invite you to do that. I invite you to join forces with us and to think about how we can be the best allies to one another as we possibly can.
Thank you. And with that, I'm going to close our 3-day online environmental engagement conference. Bye everyone, take care.